On the mountain that carried thousands of platforms, every eye was looking at the man called Ezra Zephyr. The Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom replied with a smile on his face. I'll join Alchemic Rune Academy. BOOMK. A shock hit everyone who heard that. Alchemic Rune Academy? What kind of peak was that? The weakest one who doesn't even have 500 disciples even if you combine both outer and inner disciples. Actually, in past, they were two different peaks, one that solely worked on runes and the other that taught about alchemy. However, the alchemy peak was dead for numerous years. The only peak that taught about runes was prosperous. It was active to the point that it was ranked first within the 7 peaks, but with the disappearance of the alchemic rune peak's master, Jason Feliter, the prosperous peak crumbled and nobody knew how and why, but all the geniuses from that peak either died unnatural deaths, vanished into thin air or left to other big continents. Slowly, the once prosperous peak turned into a ruined one and there was none who could re-establish it, or to be more precise, there wasn't anyone with enough talent to do so. And now, the most treasured disciple of this generation wants to join that very dead peak. Ezra, you truly have the right to choose the peak you desire to be a part of, but please, don't waste your talent in vain. Just don't join that peak for the sake of this sect. The voice of Master Franco was different. That wasn't how the master of a giant peak should talk. That's a bit offensive, Master Franco. The one who spoke this time was the man at the very last branch who represented Alchemic Rune Peak. Be that as it may, that young werewolf prince simply shook his head. I have made up my mind, Master Franco. Master Franco opened his mouth to say something, but then he closed his mouth and thought to stay quiet. Soon, Master Antero spoke again. He gave a pitying glance to Ezra before looking at the second platform as he spoke. Next comes the winner of the second platform, XYR. Although XYR was unconscious, Master Antero didn't halt and turned his sight back on Ezra Zephyr. Do you perhaps know the peak he wanted to join? No one except me can teach him. Answer while keeping that in mind. You have already wasted your talent, so be kind to your subordinates. The words of Master Antero were full of worry and displeasure. Ezra bowed to show respectful manners. He has acted haughty all this time, which is not a good sign for upper powerhouses, so he bent his back and said. He wanted to join Arcane Wizardry Peak. These words were enough to brighten the worried face of Master Antero, even though he liked Ezra, but XYR in his eyes was the rarest genius. With him at his peak, he needed nothing more. Master Antero smiled in joy and proceeded forward. Next come the winner of the third platform, Zulfi Dimitri. Zulfi didn't answer and looked at his liege. Once their eyes met each other, he said. I will let His Majesty decide in my stead. This time no one was surprised, the majority was used to it. Ezra gave him a tense look and uttered, Blood Slaughterer Peak. The man on the 4th branch of the spiritual tree smiled in satisfaction. I thought I will get none of the top candidates this time, as I intentionally favored Drake Tubble, but Ezra K. He looked at the prince. He is a great leader, he knows what's good for his subordinates. Wisdom, talent, tyranny, and benevolence. He possesses all that's needed to rule. Hearing that, Zulfi Dimitri knelt. I will never disappoint you. He then stood, turned towards Master Terror, and bowed. Thank you for having me. Kneeling was tradition, it shows respect and rank within a sovereignty, but this does not apply in sections. Instead, they bow to show respect and rank, different from sovereignty. Later, Master Antero took the name of Shapeshifter, who also gave her right of selection to Ezra. At first, Ezra wanted her to join Colleen Evil Peak, but then he changed his plans. Zenith Ghost Peak, you have an excellent body, your spiritual energy doesn't have any attribute, it simply boosts your overall strength. What you need is movement-type training, am I right, Master Albus? Ezra asked as he bowed to Master Albus. Master of Zenith Ghost Peak smiled. You took the words from my mouth. After her came Argus Waska, who already knew where he will be sent by his prince, the Divine Demon Peak. Then came the number of the Regale Arms, the smartest must join the smartest peak, and he was ordered by his prince to join Heavenly Fiend Peak. At the 7th platform stood Mahi and Gale. When her name was taken, she also looked at Ezra Zephyr, but she didn't say anything from her mouth. The prince slightly nodded his head, and she chose Colleen Evil Peak. Apart from elders and peak masters, nobody saw what happened between the two. Soon after, other disciples were selected by peak masters for their peaks. The leftovers were sent to Alchemic Rune Peak. They chatted and later for some time before they were ordered to gather with their peak members. You will soon be teleported to your respective peaks now. The competition is harsh even if we are in a weakened state. The friends of yours will face you as your rivals in this sect. Keep that in mind and grind your talent. You will be sent with an outer disciple from your peak. He will guide you as well for the first and last time. After that, you are to do everything on your own. And yes, the rewards will be sent to you in your peaks. I think you should take a look at. As the words of Master Antero ended, light flashed and the official disciples vanished. Hush! With a blinding light, the disciples who were selected for Alchemic Rune Academy were teleported to the slant of a certain mountain. There was a stone plaza that was currently a boiling cauldron of voices. Ezra Zephyr and the numerous other new Alchemic Rune Peak disciples were now gathered here, their gazes currently directed to their front with curiosity and respect. There were exactly 200 of them, including Ezra Zephyr. On the tall stage in front of them were two mats on raised pedestals on which two elderly figures sat. Boundless spiritual energy surged around them like the immeasurable sea, giving off an indescribable pressure. These two old men were the two outer elders of Alchemic Rune Peak. Hello newcomers, welcome to Alchemic Rune Peak, spoke the outer disciple who brought them. Let me introduce you to elders. The one on the left is Elder Low of Alchemy, and on the right is Elder Sunk of Imprints. The outer disciple introduced them to the new disciples. Elder Low wore black robes and had a cold, stern face that gave off an aura of strictness. Elder Sunk, on the other hand, was dressed in blue robes, widely grinning like a smiling Buddha. Behind these two elders were numerous figures, which were likely the outer disciples of Alchemic Rune Peak. On their waists hung silver or gold belts, while every individual gave off a powerful presence. However, although they were all Alchemic Rune Peak disciples, Ezra could sense a clear distinction between the two groups. The ones on the left, there was a substantial gap between them and the group on the right. As for the group on the right, their presence seemed a little colder and sterner. A sliver of arrogance could be seen in their eyes, contempt occasionally flashing within them when they looked towards the other two groups of disciples. Although the right group was larger in number, their presence was also the strongest among the two. At the front of each of the two groups stood several remarkable-looking figures. On their waists hung purple belts, clearly marking them as the highest-ranked purple belt disciples. These purple belt disciples have gathered around three figures in particular. Behind Lo was a tall, large youth. He appeared calm and steady, while a determined unyieldingness spread from between his brows. Spiritual energy faintly pulsed around him, making him feel rather imposing. This individual was called Mubarak, and was the eldest disciple under Lo, while also one of the top contenders for the outer chief disciple position. Behind Elder Sunk gracefully stood a girl dressed in white. Pretty features adorned her goose-egg-shaped face that gleamed like jade, her skin white as snow. She also boasted an amazing figure, alarming curves that started from her chest and suddenly sloped inwards at her slender waist. Many disciples in the vicinity would sneak glances at her rather often. However, her expression was cold and proud. When the purple belt that tightened around her waist was also thrown into the mix, it made many disciples feel inferior in comparison. Her name was Eiley, and was not only Elder Sunk's eldest disciple, but also his granddaughter. She was currently the strongest disciple under Elder Sunk. The third disciple that also stood behind Elder Sunk was an expressionless young man. His arms were folded across his chest, his fingers appearing rather thin and withered. Sharp light faintly flashed on his fingertips like sword light. His eyes had been shut from start to end, paying no attention to anyone. However, any gaze that looked towards him would contain a sliver of fear and respect. Even the likes of Mubarak and Eiley were a little wary of the former. This individual was called Lopap and was the strongest disciple under Elder Song. He was the one who was said to become an inner disciple sooner than the rest and was extremely powerful. He was also the strongest contender for this batch's chief disciple. These 3 individuals were the strongest among the numerous alchemic rune peak disciples. At this moment, the outer disciple who brought them took a step forward, bowed towards the 2 elders, and respectfully reported, "Elders, I have brought the new disciples." The solemn-looking elder Lo in the middle nodded before his stern gaze swept forth as he said in a low voice, "Since you've chosen Alchemic Rune Peak, all of you will be disciples of Alchemic Rune Peak from today onwards. I'll not waste any time. Our Alchemic Rune Peak's outer part currently only has 2 teaching elders, one for runes and one for alchemy. In accordance with the rules, the disciples may choose who to follow." The place fell silent as the numerous disciples secretly began to size up the 2 elders while their gazes flickered in thought, clearly weighing their options. While they sorted their thoughts in silence, a figure suddenly walked out from behind Elder Sonk. It was a golden belt disciple that gave off a sharp and formidable presence, pride visible in his eyes. His gaze swept across all the disciples before he faintly smiled and said, "I am Distio, and I would like to tell my fellow junior disciples that we have come to Alchemic Rune Peak from Blood Slaughterer Peak bearing the heavy task of reviving the peak. It is an important mission that Alchemic Rune Peak has yet to fulfill after many years, so it has now fallen on our shoulders. If any of my juniors wish to take on this important task with us, you should join Elder Sonk's faction." As his words spread, the disciples of Elder Lo began to stir, anger appearing on the faces of many of them. Distio's words were too obviously aimed at them. Elder Lo glanced at Elder Sonk and indifferently said, "Your disciples' words are truly akin to a sword, no mercy at all." The Buddha-looking Elder Sonk laughed as he nonchalantly replied, "They are from Blood Slaughterer Peak after all, and are naturally direct and straightforward, never hiding their blades. I hope that Elder Lo will not take offense." Lo coldly snorted inside but knew that he should not push the topic. After all, it had been the Supreme Leader and the other Peak Master's decision to send disciples to Alchemic Rune Peak. He too was rather helpless with regard to this, because Alchemic Rune Peak had indeed never succeeded after so many years on its own. If the Alchemic Rune Peak chief disciple position was to land in the hands of his faction, then our peak would be a peak for just name. Lo looked towards Sonk, only to see the latter helplessly shake his head. Alchemic Rune Peak was after all unable to match the other 6 peaks. All the better disciples would be taken away by the other 6 peaks, naturally leading to them growing stronger and stronger, while the Alchemic Rune Peak disciples lagged further and further behind. Even though they buy pills and medicines from Myriad Miracle Tower, they need talented men to revive alchemy. While they were speaking, Distio's words had already begun to work their magic. Most of the new disciples here had been forcibly allocated to Alchemic Rune Peak, and were thus naturally overjoyed to see Elder Sonk's faction that came from Blood Slaughterer Peak. The Blood Slaughterer Peak was, after all, one of the most popular choices amongst the Outer Mountain disciples. As such, the disciples stirred for a bit, before nearly half of them began to flood towards Distio. The sight of this caused the expressions of the disciples from the other faction to turn a little ugly. "I think you should take a look at." The cold, arrogant young lady called Eileen clenched her teeth, seething as she viciously glared at the disciples that had moved and angrily said, "A bunch of favor-currying fellows." Joined as soon as they heard the name of Blood Slaughterer Peak. It seemed there were inner quarrels as well in Elder Sonk's faction. A pleased smile was revealed on Distio's face at the sight of this, before he turned to the remaining disciples on the plaza. These disciples stood behind Ezra Zephyr, evidently waiting for him to make his decision. Amongst them were 2 who belonged to the Naren continent. One was Gil Subzi, who wanted to become an alchemist, and the other was, surprisingly, Sinzutun. He told Ezra that he has learned some small imprints in his household, and Ezra requested Master Antero to send him to Alchemic Rune Peak. After all, Ezra was the champion of the peak selection ceremony, and possessed a degree of influence. Seeing that he had yet to choose, the other disciples also decided to observe for the time being. Distio's gaze swept across Ezra Zephyr, an unknown light flashing in his eyes before he looked towards Lopap, the purple belt disciple. The latter's eyes cracked open slightly and cast an indifferent glance at Ezra. However, Lopap did not speak, merely nodding towards Distio. Distio chuckled upon seeing this, before he turned to Ezra and said, "This junior brother must be the champion of this batch's peak selection ceremony. I've long heard of your famous name. Our elder Sunk also rather admires you, and although you only managed to by some fluke take first place from junior brother Drake Tubble, given how open-minded elder Sunk is, he will naturally do his best to guide you if you join his faction." His tone was rather provocative, seemingly not caring much about the so-called champion of the peak selection ceremony. Instead, it felt as if it was Ezra's fortune to be given the chance to join them. It was all that Ezra needed. Deep in his heart, his sinister spirit laughed. The prince could see the painful death of this idiotic blabber in future. Distio, unaware of Ezra's intentions, grinned as he stared at Ezra. "What do you think about your senior brother's words? Do you want to join Elder Sunk's imprint faction?" At this moment, Elder Lo cast his gazes over. Behind him, the numerous disciples, including Mubarak and even Aili, also looked over. They had evidently also heard that the champion of the ceremony had chosen to go to Alchemic Rune Peak. This was a very rare occurrence. Under the numerous watching gazes, Ezra smiled at Distio and said, "There are as many talented geniuses as the clouds learning imprints under Elder Sunk, and being able to join them is indeed an honor." Upon hearing the prince's words, Distio immediately laughed as he smirked slightly, clearly feeling that there was nothing special about this batch's champion. A trace of disappointment flowed out in the eyes of Mubarak and Aili when they saw this. Aili coldly remarked, "The champion of this batch has no backbone." "Humph, the champion of the previous generation was senior brother Sith Wiggins, who has now become a ranked disciple. Ezra Zephyr is a far cry from him." The hierarchy in Spirit-Devouring Mountain was very clear. From lowest to highest it goes. 1. Unofficial Outer Mountains Disciples. 2. Official Outer Mountains Disciples. 3. Inner Mountains Disciples. 4. Ranked Disciples. 5. Outer Mountains Elders/Core Disciples. 6. Inner Mountain Elders. 7. Seven Peak Masters. 8. The Chosen Seven. 9. Supreme Leader. When she talked about Sith Wiggins, her eyes would ripple slightly in adoration. "Not bad, your judgment is pretty good." Distio pointed at Ezra and nodded with a smile. "Since that is the case, in the futuric." However, just as he was about to willfully appoint some silly duties, the prince's voice sounded again. "But it is exactly because there are so many talented disciples under Elder Sunk, that I feel that I would only be akin to a useless decoration there. That's why I feel that the other faction will suit me better." When Ezra's voice sounded once again on the stone plaza, it caused the atmosphere to instantly freeze as gaze after gaze was cast over in shock. No one had expected Ezra to favor the other two factions. After all, out of Alchemic Rune Peak's two factions, Elder Sunk's was clearly the most superior. In the first place, only the imprints of the spirit-devouring sect were famous. The alchemy of this sect never saw the light of fame. However, this choice was no surprise to Ezra Zephyr himself. From the very beginning, he had already decided not to choose Sunk's faction. It was because he could feel a tiny sliver of hostility in Distio's words and purple belt disciple, Lopap's seemingly unconcerned gaze, hostility that was likely due to his relationship with Drake Tubble. He knew that the sect is full of Shurian disciples. Elder Sunk is merely a puppet. The one running the faction was Lopap, or that's what Ezra had read from the encounter. The prince could already foresee the endless amount of trouble that would be sent his way if he joined Sunk's faction. Furthermore, it was more than likely that Sunk would not support him if people from the Shurian continent came seeking revenge, and instead easily discard him to appease them. Therefore, the prince would most certainly eliminate Sunk's faction from his choices to avoid such trouble. After all, he was here to revive the alchemy and make his foothold through that. Truthfully speaking, as the host of the monstrous Wolf of Norse, Fenrir, Ezra needed no one to teach him. Absolutely no one, but he had different plans. The prince's rejection also stunned the disciples under Elder Lo. Ezra's choice had likewise surpassed their expectations. Was I wrong? This junior brother is somewhat interesting. Aili grinned, a trace of admiration now present on her face. I think you should take a look at. Lopap's face stayed grave as he said, at least he has some backbonique. The other disciples from the faction also cast friendly and welcoming gazes towards Ezra. In contrast, hostility began to rise in the eyes of the disciples under Elder Sunk, their slightly chilly gazes looking towards Ezra. It was obvious that they felt the prince's rejection to be an act of humiliation towards their group. Especially Distio, whose expression fluctuated indeterminately between anger and embarrassment. He had previously been under the impression that Ezra had tactfully chosen to join them. Who could have imagined that his earlier words were merely a ruse, turning the former's earlier words into a joke? You. Distio's gaze turned piercingly chilly as he stared at the prince and sarcastically said, "Junior brother. Ezra really has character. It seems that you believe that as the champion of the peak selection ceremony, you will revive, Novi prosper the alchemy of the sect? Do you really think that every champion is like the arcane wizardry peak's senior brother Sith Wiggins?" There was no lack of mockery in his words. There were many champions of the peak selection ceremony in the spirit-devouring mountain. After all, there was one for each generation of disciples. Amongst them, there was no lack of amazingly successful disciples, but at the same time also many that ultimately fell back into mediocrity. After rebuking Ezra, Distio's tone softened slightly as he said, "Junior brother Ezra, you do have some talent, but I advise you not to be too rash. If you fail to grasp this opportunity, regret will do nothing for you in the future. Only regret will be your companion if you choose alchemy. Come with us and try the mysterious art of imprints." The werewolf prince merely chuckled in response. "Sorry, Elder Sunk's faction is too unsuitable for me. Senior Broth, Noik fellow brother Distio does not need to speak any further about this. They had the same rank of Outer Mountain Golden Belt disciple. There was no reason for Ezra to not call him a fellow disciple. Furthermore, Distio's words were always secretly threatening him, something that Ezra Zephyr could never allow. Hence, he could no longer be bothered to talk it out nicely. "Bunch of arrogant dullards," scoffed Fenrir, to which Ezra smiled. Distio's eyes hardened as an ominous look appeared on his face. He was about to speak again, but saw Lopap open his eyes, indifference within them as he waved at the former. Hence, Distio closed his mouth and venomously glared at Ezra. Lopap nonchalantly said, "Forget about it, since he is not willing. We do not lack a so-called champion of the peak selection ceremony." He did not give Ezra a second glance. In his opinion, not joining them was undoubtedly destroying one's own future. Once Ezra began to experience hardships in the future, he would naturally begin to understand how foolish he had been today. Moreover, it was only a champion of the peak selection ceremony, someone who was merely number one amongst the Outer Mountain disciples. Who in the Inner Mountains had not gone through rigorous and careful selection? Ezra would soon understand what it meant to vanish into averageness. Sonk had originally been a little interested in this batch's champion. If the latter could be recruited, Sonk would first make him apologize to Shurien disciples, before giving him proper guidance. But from the looks of it, this individual was clearly not going to cooperate. Distio understood Sonk's character and knew from his words that Ezra's actions had already turned off Elder Sonk. A gloating smile immediately revealed itself on Distio's face. However, the prince paid no attention to them. He really disliked Lopap from the bottom of his heart, and he somehow saw what kind of troublesome future awaited him if he were to join the latter's faction. Hence, his gaze turned towards Elder Lo as he cupped his fists together and said, "This disciple hopes to study alchemy under Elder Lo." Elder Lo and Mubarak exchanged a look as their expressions softened somewhat. They too never imagined that Ezra would actually end up rejecting Elder Sonk and Lopap's offer. Lo's stern face was now much more relaxed than before. He was a rather inflexible and old-fashioned person by nature, but treated his disciples with amazing earnesty. Hence, numerous disciples both respected and feared him in Alchemic Rune Peak. He looked towards Mubarak, who was the strongest disciple he had, and asked, "What do you think?" Mubarak nodded his head and said, "As the one who became the champion of the peak selection ceremony, he's naturally a good seedling." Mubarak knew that Elder Lo had been brooding over the Lopap's shift to Alchemic Rune Peak. However, due to the repeated failures for so many years, Elder Lo could only accept the arrangements made by the sect master and the other hegemons. Although Lo was strict and old-fashioned, he did give his all when it comes to his disciples. The only problem was that it was an exceedingly difficult task to find any good saplings to nurture in their alchemic rune peak, hence why his disciples still found it hard to compete with the other peaks. Now that a champion of the peak selection ceremony had at long last come their way, and had even declined to join Elder Song's faction, Mubarak knew that although Elder Lo appeared calm on the surface, his heart was surely churning with emotions. Mubarak knew that Lo would never give up, and was definitely going to duke it out with Song. So I believe that it will be best for this young guy to join our ranks. Mubarak smiled. Lo's eyebrows moved, but that face of his remained impassive. After some silence, he nodded to Mubarak. Lo gazed at Ezra Zephyr and said in a slightly soft voice, "Since that's the case, you shall join us today, and I will earnestly guide you in the path of alchemy." The prince bowed towards Elder Lo. As Lo watched, a smile finally surfaced on his stern face. With a wave of his hand, a flash of gold flew towards Ezra, turning into a golden belt. Faint, complicated runes were etched onto the golden belt as it gave off a peculiar ripple that was actually able to gather the surrounding spiritual energy. It had clearly been inscribed with a spiritual energy gathering rune and could be said to be a support-type spiritual treasure. As the champion of the peak selection ceremony, I have bestowed upon you a gold belt. A rarely heard kindness could be detected in Lo's voice. Thank you, Elder Lo. Under the many envious gazes, the prince received the golden belt. He knew that he was now formally a gold belt disciple of spirit-devouring mountains' outer mountains. As Ezra tied the gold belt around his waist, the complex and ancient runes on it glittered faintly, and the surrounding energy began to flow towards him strand by strand, ultimately slipping into his body. The numerous surrounding disciples wore looks of envy as they watched. They knew that the gold belt was not merely a beneficial tool for cultivation, but also represented one's status and perks. After wearing the gold sash, the prince moved to the side. Now that they were done with Ezra, the remaining disciples began to make their choices. The majority followed Ezra to join Elder Lo's group. After the allocation was done, perhaps because of Ezra Zephyr, the number of disciples that had joined Lo was roughly equal to Song, for the first time ever. Thus, all the new disciples were split up into two groups. Of the two factions, Elder Song had a large number of disciples, and he was indeed more of a playful and mischievous individual and did not have much interest in competing or grand aspirations. I think you should take a look at. Elder Lo, on the other hand, was very competitive. They had the least disciples, but Elder Song's disciples were clearly hard workers. Elder Song was after all from the Blood Slaughterer Peak, and the resources available to him were far greater than Elder Lo. When they were done, Elder Song stood up to leave, with no intentions of discussing anything with Elder Lo. However, it was at this moment that the silent Lo suddenly spoke. "Please wait, Elder Song." Song's foot paused as he turned around, looked at Lo and said, "What is it, Elder Lo?" Lo hesitated for a moment, before he said, "I hope to discuss the final diamond quarters of our alchemic rune peak." Song's eyes narrowed slightly. Soon after, he seemingly smiled as he mockingly swept a glance at Ezra Zephyr and said, "Elder Lo is truly a lover of talent. To think that you would even plan on preparing diamond quarters for him. However, does a new gold belt disciple like him deserve such treatment?" The prince was slightly taken aback, somewhat surprised as he looked towards Lo. During the few hours, he had gotten a basic understanding of the outer mountains. Every outer mountain disciple would be given a quarter, similar to the little houses of the unofficial outer mountain disciples. However, this quarter was clearly even more precious than the little houses. Every quarter was equipped with a spring of sorts from which an endless stream of pure spiritual energy would spout, making it extremely beneficial to one's martial prowess. The quarters were also split into different ranks, which were related to the disciple's status. From the lowest, the silver quarters, the gold quarters, and finally, the highest rank, diamond quarters. Ordinarily speaking, only a diamond belt disciple could enjoy the luxury of a diamond quarters. Hence, Ezra was rather surprised when he heard Lo intended to give him a diamond quarter. Fenrir, does Elder Lo has an aptitude in alchemy? He asked his partner. To which the wolf replied. I have to see his talent first. Ezra slightly nodded his head, and a wild thought appeared in his mind. Hearing all that, Lo slowly said, I can judge for myself whether or not he deserves it. Sonk let out a mocking laugh as he shook his head and said, There's no need for you to consider this matter any further, Elder Lo. The income of our peak is very limited, making it impossible to open many of the diamond quarters. Hence, there is only a limited number available. In accordance with our rules, our two factions will split the quarters based on performance, and since the previous 15 have already been allocated, I am determined to win the final one. All of your diamond belt disciples already have diamond quarters. Lo's expression sunk slightly. Sonk sneered. Since you feel that a new Outer Mountain disciple has the right to use a diamond quarters, do my disciples not have the same right? Lo's expression turned ugly, but he still managed to control his anger. I can barter for the diamond quarters with other things. However, Sonk waved his hand and rudely said, No need. I've already declared that I am determined to win this diamond quarters. A look of ridicule was present in his gaze as he swept a glance in Ezra's direction. Of course, he knew that Lo wanted to give the diamond quarters to Ezra Zephyr. This was why he would never let it happen. Although Sonk did not appear to care when Ezra had chosen to join Lo's earlier, it was obvious that the former held a grudge in his heart. Moreover, the prince was after all the champion of the peak selection ceremony, making him a potential threat. Hence, cutting his martial prowess resources even a little would reduce the threat he posed. Therefore, there was no way that Sonk would allow the final diamond quarters to land in Ezra's hands. Sonk smiled coldly inside. Since you value that brat so much, go ahead and give the diamond quarters of your other disciples to him. But if you do so, let's see what your disciples will end up saying. Ezra frowned as he watched the exchange between them. He had at last personally witnessed how vicious Sonk actually was. Elder Lo, although a diamond quarter is great, there is no need to rush things. There will always be a chance in the future. Ezra cupped his fists together. However, Lo shook his head. I know what I'm doing. From the looks of it, the stubborn elder was not willing to give up. Seeing the growing tension between the two parties, Elder Lo had no choice but to sigh and say, Since neither of us wishes to give in, we shall follow the rules and decide its allocation based on our peak's prowess. The next match shall be held in a month. Whoever wins then will naturally obtain the final diamond quarter. Upon hearing these words, Sonk let out an icy chuckle, before leaving with a swish of his sleeves. Then we'll see who's more capable in a month, your alchemy or my imprints. However, he cast an icy, mocking gaze at Ezra as he left. Although he did not say anything, the prince could guess what the former was thinking. You don't deserve that diamond quarter. In the wake of Sonk and his disciples' departure, the atmosphere began to relax. However, Lo's expression was still somewhat ugly, clearly not expecting that Sonk would not give any face even after he had lowered himself to ask. Eiley walked over from the side and sighed helplessly. You know full well that he looks down on us. Grandfather has been blinded by blood slaughterer peak. He is not what he used to be. Why did you still have to ask? She stayed behind and didn't depart with Elder Sonk. I think you should take a look at. She shot a glance at Ezra. The truth was, Eiley did know why in her heart. Ezra was likely very important to Lo, and he wanted to create the best conditions for the former. A diamond quarters was definitely necessary. Lo's expression darkened with anger as he said, He's just a lesser man in a position of power. Eiley shook his head, before he asked, Elder, do you have any confidence in the next quarter match? Lo's expression turned rather depressed. The spiritual quarters of Alchemic Rune Peak were originally occupied by him and Sonk's disciples. However, ever since Lopap and other disciples came from Blood Slaughterer Peak, there was no longer any peace in Alchemic Rune Peak. They had even changed the mind of Elder Sonk, who was once a good friend of Elder Lo. Sonk's faction also needed spiritual quarters, so they had to be redistributed once again. This was how the spiritual quarter matches had come about. A quarter match was basically a competition of arts between the disciples from the two factions. The alchemists show their progress in alchemy and rune masters would reveal their imprints. The winner would obtain the spiritual quarter. Alchemy faction has never won against rune faction, but there was respect and cooperation amongst them in past, but that cooperation turned into enmity as blood slaughterer peak came. Even the final diamond quarter was now being eyed by Sonk. Lo naturally also coveted the final diamond quarter, but he knew that no one on his side could match Sonk's disciples. In accordance with the rules, each disciple could only participate once in a quarter match per year. Currently, the strong disciples under Lo such as Mubarak had already used their turns in the most intense matches. Hence, he was left with only gold belt disciples to vie for the next quarter match. Although Sonk's diamond belt disciples had likewise used up their chance long ago, Lo knew that there were still quite a few exceptionally strong gold belt disciples under Sonk, for example, Distio. In comparison, Lo's gold belt disciples were quite lacking. Therefore, Lo did not have much confidence in the match to be held a month later. Eiley was also aware of the situation, and thus said in a low voice, "Why not wait a while longer, Elder? At the beginning of next year, the matches will start over once again." Lo's expression fluctuated for a moment. However, he still stubbornly shook his head in the end and declared, "I will find a way." After which, he waved to Eiley before shooting a glance at Ezra and the rest as he lifted his legs to leave. "Junior brother Ezra, we'll be fellow brother disciples in the future." Mubarak smiled at Ezra. From the looks of it, the former was a rather straightforward individual. The prince returned the smile and cupped his fists together. "Greetings, senior brother Mubarak." Mubarak shook his head to avoid formalities and replied, "Although Elder Lo seems very unapproachable, he has high hopes for you." To which, the prince smiled, a black bolt flickered in his scarlet eyes as he answered, "Then I am obligated to stand up to his hopes." The prince responded with a slight nod. Although he barely had any contact with Lo, the latter's earlier actions clearly fell into the former's eyes. Lo had obviously clashed with Sonk for the sake of obtaining the final diamond quarter for Ezra Zephyr to aid his martial prowess. After all, if it was anyone else, they would likely not risk offending an elder with pretty high status for a mere disciple. "Senior brother Mubarak, if it is too difficult, please persuade Elder Lo to drop the idea," said the prince. Although he still did not fully understand the extent of the situation, he could sense that Sonk seemed to look down on Lo's intent to contest for the final diamond quarter. Sonk and Lopap clearly believed that they had already won. Mubarak laughed bitterly. "It will be nearly impossible to persuade Elder Lo once he has made up his mind. Given his character, no one can dissuade him." Soon after, he patted Ezra's shoulder and consoled him. "You need not worry about this matter. If not because I had already participated in a cave match, I would have helped you win the last diamond quarter." The prince nodded, not speaking any further on the topic. They both moved, and Ezra followed Mubarak's lead. Mubarak stood halfway up a certain mountain and pointed to a quarter amongst the verdant greenery as he smiled and said, "Junior brother Ezra, this gold quarter shall be your accommodation for the time being." The prince raised his gaze and found a golden quarter that had been built into the mountain. Sunlight peeked through the steep cliffs around it, falling down upon the cave like a silver river. A pavilion had also been built on a cliff nearby, appearing exceptionally peaceful, tranquil and grand at the same time. An accommodation like this was many times better than the little houses of the unofficial outer mountains. Most importantly, Ezra could feel pure spiritual energy swirling around inside the cave. Anyone who stayed in it long term would surely experience amazing benefits. "Hehe, junior brother Ezra, Elder Lo really has high hopes for you. You should know that a gold quarter like is usually contested over by many gold belt disciples. You've only just joined us, and yet you've already been given one. This is very enviable to others." Mubarak sighed. However, he appeared to be quite a magnanimous person and showed no indication that he felt it unfair. He was after all the eldest disciple under Lo and had long ago gotten a diamond quarter, so there was no reason to be jealous. The prince nodded as he revealed a smile. Being so highly regarded by Elder is an honor for me, but I am ashamed that I was the cause of his humiliation. The prince added. As such, it is naturally impossible for our alchemic rune peak to vie with the other 6 peaks. It got so bad that we aren't able to occupy even a single spot in the current ranking, whether it be the outer disciple ranking or inner disciple ranking. Elder Sunk did not used to be like this in the past. It was only after repeated failures that he slowly lost his aspirations, and began to become satisfied with the newly sent disciples from Blood Slaughterer Peak, no longer caring about reviving Alchemic Rune Peak. Elder Low, on the other hand, is quite a stubborn person. He's been gritting his teeth, and refusing to give up all along, but the recent overbearing arrival of Lopap's group has indeed put a tremendous amount of pressure on Elder Low. After all, if Lopap's faction really ended up taking the chief disciple position and subsequently become the dominant, the disciples in our group will no longer be able to raise our heads in the spirit-devouring mountain. I think you should take a look at. Mubarak let out a bitter laugh. Elder Low has placed such high hopes in you because he really does not have any other choice. The only path left to him is to bet everything on you. You are after all a champion of the peak selection ceremony, and who knows, you may even become the second Sith Wiggins. At the mention of Sith Wiggins's name, admiration flitted across even the eyes of someone like Mubarak. However, he knew that the chances of a second Sith Wiggins appearing was abysmally low. He was, after all, someone who had stunned and amazed the entire spirit-devouring mountain in recent years, and now firmly sat at the head of the inner disciple rankings. Although the prince was also a champion of the ceremony, there had been many such champions over the years, but only one Sith Wiggins. Even the peak masters say that no one like him came in the last 3 decades. Ezra silently nodded. Mubarak did not waste time chit-chatting. After giving some advice, he said, "You can explore Alchemic Rune Peak during the next 3 days to get used to things here. However, you can't miss the morning lesson on Alpha Cliff in 3 days. It's the biggest benefit we get after entering the outer mountains." Alpha Cliff? Ezra Zephyr was somewhat puzzled. However, Mubarak did not explain, merely mysteriously smiling as he said, "You'll know when the time comes." He turned around and was just about to leave when he suddenly hesitated for a moment. "Junior brother Ezra, you should be more cautious for the time being, and try your best to keep a low profile." The prince was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Mubarak revealed a helpless smile and said, "Elder Low values you far too much, which I believe will make the other brother disciples feel a sense of unfairness. Truthfully speaking, even I am a little envious of you, what more the others." Although the prince was the champion in the most recent peak selection ceremony, he was too new to the outer mountains and lacked experience. However, Elder Low had not only gifted this newest disciple a gold quarter but was even doing his best to get a diamond quarter for the former. When such actions landed in the eyes of the other disciples, it was easy for feelings of unfairness to rise in their hearts. The prince silently nodded when he heard this. Mubarak had nothing left to say, stepping onto a spiritual energy cloud as he rose into the sky and swiftly disappeared into the distance. The prince remained standing on the spot, frowning slightly as he watched Mubarak leave. He was naturally aware that Elder Low's actions would easily draw out feelings of jealousy and envy in the other disciples. The bottom line was that these disciples felt that he did not deserve such attention and treatment. His eyes narrowed slightly. The current reason he had come to the spirit-devouring mountain was for the sake of growing stronger and eventually earning his kingdom the power to destroy the Brown Mane Empire. Since the diamond quarter would be very beneficial to him, he naturally also coveted it. Hence, he did not intend to voluntarily give up just because other disciples felt it was unfair. He had only tried to turn it down previously because he did not fully understand the situation, and did not wish to accept such kindness from others for no reason. His eyes spun in thought. After some silence, he turned around and entered the quarter. He did not wish to comment on Mubarak telling him to keep a low profile, because he understood that trying to be low-key alone would not be of any use in this situation. If anyone was unable to accept it, he would beat them till they did. Thinking that, Ezra let out an evil grin. in a certain quarter. A dozen figures were seated here, unhappy voices sounding one after another. Elder Lowe is being way too unfair. Even if that snot-nosed brat Ezra managed to win the peak selection ceremony, he's only recently entered the Outer Mountains. To think that he would even be given a gold quarter. Agreed, that gold quarter was clearly being eyed by senior brother Pele, but has now ended up being taken away right under our noses. Most importantly, from the looks of it, Elder Lowe will likely send us out in the quarter match a month later, but if we win, the diamond quarter will probably end up in Ezra's hands. On what basis should he enjoy such treatment? Just because he's the champion? It's not like we've never seen one before. The numerous disciples shared their grievances, releasing all of the unhappiness in their hearts. Amongst the crowd was a long-haired young man whose expression appeared exceptionally stormy. It was the disciple called Pele. He had been eyeing that gold quarter for the longest time and had been saving spirit jades to trade for it. In the end, it had been so casually given to a new disciple by Elder Lowe. How could he possibly accept this? Pele icily chuckled and said, "It will not be so easy for a mere new disciple to step on me." What does senior brother Pele plan on doing? Pele's eyes narrowed as a faint smile appeared on his lips. There are not many gold belt disciples amongst us who can still participate in the cave match. If nothing unexpected happens, I will likely be one of the choices. I will gather some of the other senior brothers who also feel that Elder Lowe is showering that brat with too much attention. When the time comes, we will propose that if we were to take part in the cave match, the elder must first agree that the diamond quarter will not be given to that snot-nosed kid. I think you should take a look at. These words immediately drew a series of approval from the group. Senior brother Pele is right. Ezra may have some talent, but he is ultimately only a new disciple. We must first make him understand his social standing. Before us, he's only an inexperienced and new disciple. That's right. The sight of the crowd's indignant appearances caused a smile to rise on Pele's face. He raised his cup and downed it in a single go, before lifting his head and peering into the distance as an icy smile flashed in his eyes. New kid, I will let you know that even if Elder Lowe thinks highly of you, you still have to abide by the rules here. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. After 3 days of acclimatization, the prince had gradually familiarized himself with Alchemic Rune Peak's outer mountains. At the same time, he had also begun to realize the benefits of spiritual quarters. In the outer mountains, every disciple possessed a quarter, the only difference being its rank. Every quarter was connected to an energy mountain, and the higher-ranked spiritual quarter was linked to higher-ranked energy mountains. At the deepest part of each spiritual quarter was a spring, which was also the connection point to its energy mountain. Pure, boundless spiritual energy would endlessly gush out from spring, ultimately forming a faint mist that filled the quarter. The effectiveness of training in such an environment was incomparable to the single energy mountain used by tens of thousands of people in the unofficial outer mountains. Hence, the prince was already able to feel the spiritual energy in his body progress after the short 3 days he stayed in the gold quarter. This made him realize how huge of a gap there was between an unofficial and official outer mountain disciple. However, although the spiritual quarter was pretty damn amazing, it did come at a cost. It was said that one could exchange spirit jade for a spiritual quarter, and the price of a gold quarter was about 10,000 spirit jade pieces. In addition, a maintenance fee of several hundred spirit jade pieces had to be paid every month. This was clearly not cheap at all. Fortunately, outer mountain disciples were treated better than unofficial outer mountain disciples and would receive over 1,000 spirit jade pieces every month. What's more, the missions given by the task pavilion in the outer mountains were much more rewarding. All these factors allowed the outer mountain disciples to upkeep their quarters. In Ezra's case, there was no pressure with regard to this matter. His previous work as a spiritual technique instructor had already earned him a sizable fortune. In addition, his gold quarter was given to him by Elder Lowe, saving him over 10,000 spirit jade pieces. The only thing he had to worry about was the routine maintenance cost. In his opinion, things that could benefit his overall growth were more useful, while spirit jade was just a sort of means to an end. After practicing in the gold quarter for 3 days, Ezra was now a little more interested in the higher-ranked diamond quarter. Since a gold quarter was already so amazing, what level did a diamond quarter reach? What's more, it was said that if one became one of the 10 rankers in the outer mountains, one would be able to enjoy an entire energy mountain alone. There would only be a single spiritual quarter on these energy mountains, and all its spiritual energy would be provided solely to that lone spiritual quarter. One's martial prowess would likely be even more rapid in such a place. Those spiritual quarters were called ruby quarters and were even higher ranked than the diamond grade. Of course, even Elder Low and the rest did not have the qualifications to give a quarter of that caliber. Approval would have to be given by the Peak Master of Alchemic Rune Peak and the other 6 Peak Masters. However, a ruby quarter was too distant to Ezra Zephyr at this current time. For now, he decided that he would first aim for a diamond quarter. He had finally been able to sort out his thoughts towards Low over the past few days. Since the latter valued him so greatly, there was no need for him to modestly decline anymore. He understood that Elder Low merely hoped that this new champion of the peak selection ceremony would be different from the rest. Low prayed that after some grooming, Ezra would be able to display his potential and rise above the numerous other disciples to eventually become the chief disciple of Alchemic Rune Peak, evolve the alchemy and bring back glory to them. Although that idea was naive, alchemy is not a trivial thing, since the pill formulas are so rare and kept secret, not to mention the complicated procedures where a single mistake could destroy not only the pill but valuable ingredients as well. How could a mere new disciple from a remote continent revive the alchemy? This goal would seem illogical to any sane mind. However, Low was lucky, tremendously lucky. To his fortune, this goal of his was exactly the same as Ezra's own. After all, he intentionally chose this peak. Ezra looked at the beautiful sunlight as he came out and stepped onto a boulder and rose into the air, heading straight for the so-called Alpha Cliff. Along the way, he met Elder Low and the other new disciples. They made quite a ruckus as they traveled together. After about a dozen minutes, their speed gradually slowed as their gazes looked to the front where a giant mountain pierced through the clouds. At its peak seemed to be a giant green cliff. The cliff looked very out of place with the mountain, as if it had been placed here from somewhere else. This cliff was likely the Alpha Cliff. On the green cliff stood a large green hall. Numerous spiritual energy clouds were currently flying over, landing one by one just outside the hall. The prince and the rest also landed before the giant green hall and discovered 3 simple, bold words above it. Pill Seeker Hall. Ezra and the gang stepped into the hall, finding its insides rather spacious and grand. The interior of the hall seemed to be built up like steps, and at the very top sat Elder Low's figure. On the wide steps that descended downwards were old-looking cauldrons I think you should take a look at. These cauldrons came in 3 varieties: silver, gold, and diamond. The diamond cauldrons were located higher up, and were nearest to Elder Low, followed by the gold cauldrons and then the silver cauldrons at the very bottom. It was obvious that these mats represented the status of the disciples. Ezra's gaze swept across the mats, faintly feeling a peculiar ripple spreading from them. These were no simple cauldrons at all. There were only 8 diamond cauldrons, and in front of those cauldrons were mats, on which 8 figures were already seated. At their head was Mubarak, and they were clearly the 8 diamond belt disciples under Elder Low. When Ezra walked into the large hall, numerous gazes shot towards him. Mubarak smiled warmly at him, but the other disciples' expressions were unreadable. The 3 diamond belt disciples closest to Mubarak in particular seemed to size Ezra up with sharp gazes. "Ezra, you shall sit there." Elder Low likewise caught sight of the prince. However, the former's expression remained as cold and stoic as a rock as he extended a hand and pointed towards a certain spot below. It was the 3rd spot amongst the gold cauldrons. Elder Low's actions immediately caused a buzz to grow in the hall, envy appearing in the eyes of many disciples. The mats here were not some free-for-all seating. The closer one was to the front, the greater the benefits. At the same time, it also represents one's status, and the third gold cauldron represented the third seat of the gold belt disciples. If Ezra was seated there, it meant that even the more veteran gold belt disciples that had joined earlier but were ranked below the third seat had to call him senior brother. In the official Outer Mountains, rank was even more strictly adhered to, and was nowhere near as relaxed as the unofficial Outer Mountains where one would address another based on age. Normally speaking, however, new disciples would be placed towards the back, and slowly rise up as time passed. It was very rare to see someone like Ezra Zephyr who would be given the gold belt third seat right away. The prince also understood this, but he was already over it. Since Elder Low was grasping onto him as if he was the final straw, there was no need for him to act too modestly. He would receive any benefit with open arms, all he had to do was return the favor later on, see or not, depending on how it affects his plan. Thus, he ignored the many gazes that were sizing him up or judging him and walked directly towards the mat in front of third gold cauldron. However, the moment he reached it, he suddenly felt a gaze filled with hostility. He looked over, only to find that it belonged to a long-haired young man that was seated on the fourth gold mat and was currently looking at him with a dark expression. It was the youth known as Palais. The third seat had originally been his, but he had to give it up to Ezra Zephyr today. See NDSLZVL? ZM Elder Low's treatment of Ezra was something Palais was extremely jealous of and unable to accept. It may be true that Ezra was the champion of the ceremony, but so what? It was not like none of the champions of the past had eventually been surpassed by numerous other disciples and returned to mediocrity. Was Elder Low really so convinced that Ezra could become the second Sith Wiggins? Even if he has the same talent or let's assume, higher talent. It will simply rot in this alchemy faction of Forsaken Peak. Ezra paid no attention to the many skeptical gazes that were sizing him up. As for the clearly fuming Palais, he too was ignored by the former as Ezra walked forward and seated himself on the third gold mat. Upon seeing how rude Ezra was, some of the disciples frowned slightly, evidently feeling that this new disciple was quite arrogant. Even if Elder Low did have high hopes for him, it was merely with regard to the potential he might have. At this current point in time, they felt that the second-level core formation expert Ezra Zephyr basically did not have the qualifications to sit in that spot. However, it was after all Elder Low's arrangement, so even if they were unhappy about it, they could only endure for the time being and cast indifferent looks at Ezra Zephyr. Palais also took in a deep breath, suppressing the anger in his heart, though the gaze that looked towards the prince grew increasingly dark. As such, the atmosphere in the hall turned strangely suffocating. At the very top, Elder Low naturally detected the strange atmosphere, causing him to frown slightly for a moment. How could he not know that his actions would surely cause resentment to rise in the hearts of some disciples? However, there was really nothing else he could do. Alchemic Rune Peak had never gotten a champion of the peak selection ceremony in centuries, and since he had encountered one for the first time, Elder Low could only give it a try. Of course, he knew just how insanely difficult it was to encounter an exceptional genius who is as good in alchemy as he is in martial prowess, but since there was no longer any way out, he really had no other option. Thus, Elder Low soon reaffirmed his resolution, his gaze sweeping across the place as he said in a serious voice, "In a month, we will be having a quarter match with Sunk's faction. This match will determine who the final diamond quarter goes to, so we cannot fail. Since all the diamond belt disciples have already used up their turns, I will be sending gold belt disciples to participate. Bob, Blaze, and Palais. I hope to send you 3 as our lineup." Bob and Blaze were the current first and second seat gold sash disciples, while Palais was the fourth seat. The 3 of them were considered the expert alchemists amongst the gold belt disciples. No one immediately responded to Elder Low's words. Bob and Blaze's eyes seemed to flicker in thought, while Palais secretly shot a look at them, took a deep breath, and said, "Elder Low, we are willing." Low's impassive face relaxed a little. However, before he could say anything, Palais began to speak again, "But we hope to inquire how the diamond quarter will be allocated." Elder Low frowned. He had made himself very clear 3 days earlier. The diamond quarter was prepared for Ezra, and yet Palais was still asking even while knowing the answer. "I plan to give it to Ezra Zephyr." Elder Lo's tone was indifferent. I think you should take a look at. The corners of Pele's eyes twitched for a moment before he gritted his teeth and said, although it is somewhat disrespectful, aren't Elder's actions a little unfair? We have to do the heavy lifting of being sent out to battle, while Ezra reaps all the benefits? According to the rules, the diamond quarter should go to one of the three that participated. It doesn't make sense for an outsider to do nothing and yet enjoy the profits. Several disciples secretly nodded in approval at Pele's words. Pele, how dare you? Mubarak at the very front roared in anger. Elder Lo waved his hand at Mubarak and turned his face towards Pele. His expression turned slightly ugly as he said in a low voice. Are you questioning me? Pele hastily cupped his fists together and said, Disciple does not dare. We have worked hard for the sake of Alchemic Rune Peak, and understand the pressure Elder Lo is facing. Hence, if there really is someone who can become our main pillar of strength, we will naturally give him or her our full support. However, I'm afraid that some people may not be able to share Elder Lo's heavy burden, and may waste away the hope and expectations of our numerous fellow disciples. His words were full of righteousness, but they secretly hinted that Ezra Zephyr had neither the qualifications nor capability in alchemy. He won the championship solely by his power, but alchemy is another thing. Elder Lo's expression grew darker and darker. Just as he was about to berate Pele, another voice suddenly sounded, Please do not be angry, Elder Lo. Although junior brother Pele has been rather rash to offend Elder Lo, he does not possess any ill will. Junior brother Ezra is indeed the champion of the latest peak selection ceremony, but he is ultimately still too inexperienced in alchemy. If we give him a year or two, he may be able to meet Elder Lo's expectations, and I'm sure that no one will object. Thenel. Lo looked over, only to find that a young man with an earnest expression beside Mubarak had spoken. His name was James Endoro and was the second seat diamond belt disciple, second only to Mubarak. Ezra calmly glanced at James Endoro. Although the latter's speech sounded nicer, the hidden meaning within was clear. He was saying that the current Ezra did not deserve to possess a diamond quarter. He was undoubtedly supporting Pele. James clearly had some influence over the other disciples. After he spoke, several disciples immediately voiced out their agreement, making the hall become rather noisy for a time. Especially when two other diamond belt disciples indicated their support, making the opposition grow louder and louder. At the back of the hall, Elder Lo and the other new disciples had worried looks in their eyes as they gazed at Ezra Zephyr's figure from far away. They had not expected so many disciples to object. If this matter was not handled properly, Ezra's reputation would be affected. However, they also understood that new disciples like them basically did not have any right to speak in such a setting. They were not the only ones. Even Lo frowned deeply at this scene. However, they were unaware of one thing. The man they were blackballing was the atrocious werewolf prince, Ezra Zephyr. He did have the option to overpower all opposition with force, but he still had to rely on the Pele trio for the cave match. If their hearts weren't in it, their chances of victory would turn even more minuscule, practically giving away the diamond quarter for free. Elder Lo was silent for a long time before he slowly turned towards the prince and asked, Ezra, what do you think? An almost undetectable pleased look rose from the corners of Pele's mouth when he heard this. Elder Lo was evidently unable to ignore the objection from so many disciples, causing his previous insistence to waver a little. Pele's gaze swept past Ezra from the corner of his eye as he icily chuckled in his heart. This kid was too much of a greenhorn. Did you really believe that you could ignore the rules just because Elder Lo has high hopes for you? Swatting you down is as easy as flipping my hand. Everything that had happened today was clearly the result of Pele's handiwork. Under the numerous watching gazes, Ezra's expression remained calm from start to end. Truthfully speaking, though he was indeed a little interested in the diamond quarter, it had not reached the stage where he absolutely needed to have it. However, Pele's hostility and actions triggered the prince a little. He surmised that the various happenings today were most likely orchestrated by Pele, all for the sake of trying to keep the prince down. He tilted his head and smirked at Pele with an icy gaze. Upon detecting Ezra's gaze, the corners of Pele's lips rose slightly in contempt as he nonchalantly said, "Junior brother Ezra, one should eat one mouthful at a time, or take things step by step. The repercussions of attempting to reach the sky in a single leap are usually far too great. Listen to your senior brother and train properly for a year or two first. By that time, it will probably be easier for you to entertain such thoughts." Ezra merely smiled without commenting, and said, "According to the rules, I'm currently the third seat, while you're the fourth seat. You should be calling me senior brother instead." Pele's face twisted as he let out a mocking, icy chuckle. The prince ignored the former, raising his head as he said, "Elder Low, I feel that following the rules may not be a bad thing." James immediately smiled when he heard this, and said, "It's great that junior brother Ezra thinks so." Elder Low slowly said, "You intend to give up on the diamond quarter?" Pele laughed happily. Looks like Ezra could not handle the pressure, and knew that he still did not have the qualifications to own a diamond quarter. However, Ezra chuckled as he shook his head. Didn't junior brother Pele say earlier that according to the rules, the diamond quarter should be given to one of the three participants? Since that is the case, I volunteer to participate. Please allow me to become one of the three representatives for the quarter match. I think you should take a look at." Since Pele was being so overbearing, Ezra was not someone who shows mercy. Uproar. Ezra's words instantly caused the entire hall to explode into noise. The smile on Pele's face turned slightly rigid. Soon after, the mocking look on his lips grew even wider as he pointed at Ezra and said, Ezra, you really are cluelessly arrogant." Pele mumbled and said, "Do you believe the quarter match is the same as the peak selection ceremony?" He shook his head and stared at Ezra with cold eyes. "I'll be blunt, you still do not possess the qualifications to participate in the quarter match. You may want to go there and humiliate yourself, but we do not." When Ezra's words landed in the giant hall, it immediately drew a wave of stunned gazes. No one had even considered that he would plan on participating in the cave match. One must know that although the Diamond Belt disciples from both sides were no longer able to participate, the disciples sent would be the elites of the Gold Belt. Though Ezra was also a Gold Belt disciple, he was after all far too new, and there was still a tremendous gap between him and the older disciples. Ezra surely trampled Drake Tubble, despite being weaker by 3 levels. There was no doubt that his power and martial prowess is at the level of top genius. However, he was currently in the alchemic rune peak. His power and powerful spiritual techniques are meaningless here, what matters is his proficiency in alchemy. As such, many felt that Ezra basically did not qualify to participate in the contest of quarters. Hence why Pele could not help but mock the former after hearing his words. However, Ezra ignored the mockery and the skeptical gazes, only looking straight at Elder Low with a calm expression. Elder Low had likewise been stunned, Ezra Zephyr's actions clearly out of his expectations. Soon after, he began to frown. At the end of the day, what he valued in Ezra was the latter's potential. Amongst the new disciples was a member of Bloodfang Kingdom. He was none other than Gil Subzi, and he knew that although Ezra had managed to defeat the 5th-level core formation expert Drake Tubble in the peak selection ceremony, he has never practiced alchemy. If any other ordinary disciple had said such words, Elder Low would have berated him or her long ago. However, Ezra Zephyr was after all somewhat different from the rest. Hence, Elder Low did not rebuke Ezra's behavior, and merely said, "Ezra, you don't have to force yourself. There is no need to compete with others for the time being. Given your talent, you will surely begin to truly stand out after a year or two." Although he did have high hopes for Ezra, Elder Low believed that the former had only said those words in the heat of the moment. See NDSLZVL? ZM in additional, this matter affects the face of our faction, and we cannot afford to make any reckless decisions. Pele coolly looked at Ezra Zephyr upon hearing this. The prince calmly replied, "Elder Low, as the saying goes, one should not get a reward one does not deserve. If I do not make any contributions, I will not be able to accept the diamond quarter even if we do end up winning it." Pele sneered and said, "At least you still have some self-awareness." The prince shot the former an indifferent glance, Before continuing, Elder Low must feel that I am not strong enough, but there's a simple solution. Allow me to have a pill concocting match with one of the 3 current representatives. If I somehow win, I will replace him, while if I lose, I will naturally no longer speak of this matter and not entertain any thoughts about the diamond quarter. By this point, Ezra's true goal was finally revealed. How could he not know that numerous of the more senior disciples looked down on him because he was new? At the same time, they also felt that Elder Low was being very unfair. However, they did not have the courage to raise their objections so publicly like Pele, but the truth was that they refused to acknowledge Ezra in their hearts. If not, Pele would not have managed to garner so much support. Therefore, he would use the most direct and effective method. No argument could beat the hard truth of reality. Uproar. Sure enough, Ezra's words caused another wave of noise to rise in the hall, every disciple dumbstruck once again. No one had expected Ezra to have such charisma. He actually intended to use one of the 3 participants as an example. Was he crazy? One must know that Bob, Blaze, and Pele were all medium yellow-grade alchemists. Where had Ezra found the courage to suggest facing them in a concocting match? In the Naren continent, alchemists are divided into 4 ranks: yellow grade, black grade, earth grade, and heaven grade. All 4 have 3 stages, namely, lower, medium and upper. They too had never expected Ezra Zephyr to be so naive. Just below Elder Low, Mubarak was also quite amazed as he let out a helpless chuckle. Junior brother Ezra was indeed no kind man and refused to lose out even a little. But was a counterattack like this a little too reckless? The other Diamond Belt disciples also chuckled as they nodded. From their appearances, they clearly felt that Ezra was not using his head. This was practically akin to a calf being unafraid of a tiger. Sure, he had courage, but he lacked self-awareness. I think you should take a look at. Elder Low was both surprised and amazed as he stared at Ezra Zephyr. The latter's suggestion had once again surpassed his expectations. After some silence, he finally said, "You mean to challenge one of the 3 to see who is most suitable to participate in the quarter match? See ndsnzvl.czm." His gaze flickered in thought as he slowly continued, "Are you certain, Ezra? Once I agree, there will be no turning back. If you end up losing, the diamond quarter will truly be out of your reach." The prince nodded with a calm face. Elder Low took one deep look at Ezra Zephyr, before he ultimately said, "Since that is your decision, we shall do as you suggested. Which of the 3 do you choose as your opponent?" Ezra's gaze slowly shifted under the numerous watching eyes in the hall, no surprise whatsoever as it ultimately paused on Pele. Since Pele was the one who had kicked up such a fuss, he shall be used to establish Ezra's reputation in Alchemic Rune Peak. Pele was likewise unsurprised. Instead, he grinned as he shook his head towards Bob and Blaze, and jokingly said, "I can't believe that the day will come when I'm being treated as a soft persimmon. Ah well, teaching a new junior how to behave is something a senior should do. I shall accept this challenge." His tone indicated that he felt no pressure at all, but was instead ready to toy with Ezra Zephyr. Numerous disciples softly laughed around him. Elder Low slowly said, "Since that is the case, the match between the 2 of you shall be held 5 days later. The victor shall be allowed to become one of the 3 participants for the quarter match." Elder Low's gaze paused on Ezra's figure. He had still decided to give Ezra Zephyr more time because, from a certain point of view, he hoped that Ezra would really be able to create a miracle. If that happened, it would mean that the prince truly did possess the potential that would enable him to stand against the masses. However, if Ezra were to lose, Elder Low would not be able to stop himself from feeling disappointed, because it meant that Ezra was merely reckless, and someone with such character could never be destined for greater things. In the wake of Ezra and Pele's match being settled, the atmosphere in the hall changed once again, numerous gazes filled with pity as they constantly glanced towards Ezra Zephyr. It was obvious that almost no one believed Ezra would be able to beat Pele. The latter was after all a medium yellow-grade alchemist. In fact, some of the disciples even felt that due to being unable to bear the pressure of so many people objecting to him, Ezra had intentionally found an excuse for him to gracefully leave the stage. This idea made several disciples secretly nod their heads in approval. At least this new disciple was still somewhat tactful and understood that a diamond quarter was still out of his reach. Elder Low slowly withdrew his gaze as he sighed softly inside. Ezra, I hope that you do not disappoint me. In the crowd of those who don't believe in Ezra, there was a certain youngster, a chubby one, who had the utmost belief in Ezra. Seeing all that in front of his eyes, he unintentionally let out a giggle and mumbled. They are unaware that His Majesty will shock the souls out of them. He was Gil Subzi. Elder Sonk sighed in disdain as he shook his head. That disciple called Ezra really knew how to stir things up. To think that he would stir up such a sensation on his first day of training. A disciple chuckled from the side and said, I've heard that Ezra has volunteered to be one of the 3 participants in the upcoming cave match. Eiley was taken aback by this information. Soon after, her red lips curled downwards as she disdainfully said, I was just beginning to feel that he was not too bad. How did he suddenly become so rash and ignorant? From what Eiley could see, Ezra's actions were rather foolish. No matter how much of a master you are in alchemy, you're still only an apprentice, not even lower yellow grade alchemist for now. In comparison, who do you think will be participating in the quarter match? The most outstanding gold belt disciples of the imprint faction, of course. CDSLsvel.czm, these were elites even amongst them. Agreed. The disciple nodded in agreement, before he said, I've also heard that numerous senior disciples under Elder Low are quite unhappy about this affair, especially Pele because he's the one that Ezra intends to replace. Pele, huh? I've heard that he's quite good. Remarked Eiley. Due to Ezra's insistence, he ended up fixing a match with Pele. They will fight in 4 days, and the winner will represent Elder Low's faction during the quarter match. I'm of the opinion that there was some dispute with regards to who would ultimately possess the diamond quarter. Even if Elder Low has high hopes for Ezra, it still drew many objections from the other disciples. As such, Ezra has no choice but to accept this duel, because according to the rules, only those that have participated will have the right to be allocated the reward. Eiley said, Elder Low's side already does not have a good chance of victory. With Ezra as extra baggage, how can they possibly aim for the diamond quarter? The disciple chuckled and replied, perhaps they're hoping for a fluke. There are after all, still 2 other participants. If they manage to win, it would be an overall victory even if Ezra loses. Eiley's brows furrowed as she said, if that is the case, he's really too shameless. She shook her head, the amazement from earlier, due to Ezra's decision, completely fading away. Looks like pushing Ezra to Elder Low is actually a good thing. If not, we'll be the ones others will be talking about. Never mind, they are the ones who will end up being humiliated. Let them do as they please. With these words, she gladly patted her full bosom as it swayed slightly. Elder Sonk and others were at Imprint Seeker Hall. Below Sonk, the young man called Lopap was seated on the diamond belt first seat and Eiley was on second. He had a towering figure that made others feel a faint pressure as if they were facing a mountain. Sonk's gaze swept downwards as he indifferently said, Kimba, Andrew, Sliso. Upon hearing Elder Sonk speak, 3 young men on the 3 closest gold mats respectfully responded. Present. Sonk said, the 3 of you shall participate in the upcoming quarter match, are all of you confident? At the gold belt disciple's first seat, Kimba, who wore black clothes, chuckled softly and answered, Elder Sonk need not worry, the gold belt disciples of Elder Low's faction are nothing to be feared. He paused for a moment, before continuing, as for Ezra, I've heard that he will be contesting Pele for the place of the final participant. We are not familiar with this person. He's merely a little clown, and there's no need to pay any attention to him. Since Low's group wants to humiliate themselves, we'll give them as much humiliation as they want. Said Elder Sonk. Kimba nodded, but on the second diamond seat, Eiley frowned, I think you should take a look at. After this matter was settled, Sonk turned his gaze towards Lopap, his expression softening slightly as he said, Lopap, the competition for the chief disciple position will be held at the end of the year. You must not fail. Lopap opened his eyes, a sharp light surging within them as if they contained sword light. He gave a faint nod as he said, "Don't worry, Elder Lo, the other faction only has Mubarak and James Andoro. Although they are good alchemists, they are still not my match. The position of chief disciple will definitely end up in my hands." His tone was calm, but it contained an unquestionable confidence. Sonk let out a satisfied chuckle. "That's good, you'll be the chief disciple, and then slowly, the whole peak will be in our hands." At the mention of the whole peak, the light in Lopap's eyes finally brightened for a moment, as if a fire was burning within them. From what he could see, the position of the chief disciple was his to take whenever he chose to, and he did not face much competition. The other faction was just too useless, and the disciples there were too ordinary. The only ones who just barely made the mark were Mubarak and James, but neither posed much of a threat towards him. The reason why he had been willing to follow Elder Sonk to Alchemic Rune Peak was that he would gain the right to be a chief disciple, an outstanding position, once he became the chief disciple of the outer mountain of Alchemic Rune Peak. He had only been able to rank 21st amongst the Blood Slaughterer Peak disciples. Without mentioning the top 5, even the top 20 had an edge over him, and had been able to suppress him from start to end. Even if the number 1 had stepped down from his position as one of the chief disciples in the future, that ranked second guy would definitely replace the former and then ranked third. But most importantly, the Elder of Outer Mountain greatly valued the top 10, which he was not part of. Hence, even if Lopap stayed behind in Blood Slaughterer Peak, he would never have a chance to reach the rank he wanted. Uevelusp, calm. Lopap's eyes lowered slightly, unable to accept this outcome. "When I become the chief disciple of Alchemic Rune Peak in the future and join the ranks of the chief disciples, then elders and the rest, if you will understand that I, Lopap, am not weaker than anyone else," he said as he remembered the faces from Blood Slaughterer Peak. In the depth of a certain gold quarter. Ezra was deep in thought. His hands suddenly came together as a ball of light floated out from his palm. Inside was an old book that seemed akin to the rising sun, giving off a scorching aura. It was the prize Ezra Zephyr had received as the champion of the Peak Selection Ceremony, the Peak Tier Gamma Layer Spiritual Technique, the Sun God Memoir. Ezra's senses began to probe the ancient book, only opening his eyes a long time later. As expected of a true Gamma Layer Spiritual Technique, much stronger than 8 Lost Dragons, it's going to be extremely complex and troublesome to practice. Ezra Zephyr frowned a bit. The power of the Sun God Memoir was indeed terrifying, far surpassing other Gamma Layer spiritual technique could muster. However, the conditions to learn it were exceedingly strict, likewise far beyond the difficulty of the Gamma Layer skills or 5th and 6th circle spell. To learn the Sun God Memoir, one required the assistance of external resources such as the 9 Suns Crystal, the Heavenly Flames Rock Essence, and other similar items. All of them were pretty rare, and it would likely take quite some time to gather. After giving it some thought, the prince kept away the book again. His match with Pele was too close, and there was clearly no time to spend on the Sun God Memoir for the time being. It's a pity that the Divine Spirit Ablution needs 2 more months of preparation before it will be ready, or I would have been able to reach the next level through it. Ezra shook his head regretfully. The other prize from the Peak Selection Ceremony was the Divine Spirit Ablution, but since the time was not right, he would not be able to utilize it for now. While Ezra was still mulling over the situation, he suddenly heard the voice of his partner, the monstrous Wolf of Norse. "I can't believe that you managed to fall into such trouble over a single Delta Layer skill." Fenrir laughed. "Boy, don't worry, I am here. All you need right now is to control your spiritual energy to the utmost." Ezra was puzzled. "I can control it very well, what do you mean?" Hearing that, Fenrir laughed evilly. "Haha, is that so? Then let me show you hell." He cackled loudly. Ezra's troubles were expected. This was very normal. A new disciple would surely be bullied by the senior disciples for a period of time. It could be said to be a certain unspoken rule of sorts, but Ezra was different, he was a bully himself. If he wanted to accept the Diamond Quarter with a clear conscience, he would have to first ensure all the other disciples had no objections, or it would only bring about more trouble in the future. To prevent such disputes, the most direct method was to display his strength and force the senior disciples to acknowledge him. Hence, even if Pele had not provoked the prince, he would have looked for some other avenue to display his prowess. A figure landed outside the gold quarter of Ezra Zephyr. He knocked on the door. "Come in," said Ezra. The door opened without a sound, showing how well oiled it was. The figure came in. He was Mubarak, the first diamond belt disciple. He saw his junior in sweat. His body was drenched in sweat as if he was having a spar. "Junior brother Ezra, your opponent is a lower yellow alchemist, are you prepared?" teased Mubarak. Ezra laughed along but didn't reply. He spoke in a joking manner and tossed a small finger-sized scroll towards Ezra Zephyr. This was just sent by Elder Low. The prince caught the scroll and opened it. The thick, pungent smell of ink immediately dashed out into his nose. He opened the scroll fully and scanned it. This was obviously the pill formula of match and names of ingredients. It was a lower yellow-grade pill. Lightning flashed in Ezra's eyes as he said, "So this is the pill I have to concoct? Youth refreshing pill." This was the pill of the lowest grade, the youth refreshing pill. It glows one's skin and removes the dead cells. It has nothing to do with martial prowess and was just helpful to outer appearance, highly demanded by females. "You're pretty ambitious, and I will support you. But, don't take this lightly, Pele is a lower yellow-grade alchemist for 2 years, he has the experience," cautioned Mubarak. Ezra touched the palm on his right hand as he grinned, "I'll make him dance on my palm." Mubarak shook his head, speaking no further on this topic as his gaze suddenly locked onto a crimson creature lazily resting on a mat. Not long after he saw another of such creature. It was cerulean this time. They both looked like wolf cubs. An extremely fearful smile appeared on his face. For some unknown reason, he felt tremendous power from these little cubs. "Brother Ezra, whose cubs are these?" asked Mubarak in a worried manner. The prince wheeled his head to look at them and smiled. "They are my contracted martial animals. The crimson one is Sko, LL, and the cerulean one is called Hattie." "Sko, LL and Hattie." Mubarak gulped and questioned again. "What is their tier?" "Second tier, why, senior brother?" Ezra knew the answer, but still asked to avoid unnecessary questions. No see, it's nothing." He waved his head. "Second tier, then why I was intimidated by them?" He pondered. Ezra grinned as he looked at Mubarak. "Senior brother Mubarak, tell the others that I will be secluding myself to practice the formula and won't be attending the next morning's class." Mubarak acknowledged before turning around to leave. It was Elder Low and his faction who were there to learn about alchemy again. Resorting to such unnecessary measures even though you only have a few short days. Pele shook his head, a slight sneer and contempt flowing out in his eyes. "I think you should take a look at Ezra. Oh Ezra, you have to show me all your cards. If you lack the talent, don't blame your senior brother for bullying you." Several of his gold belt disciple friends around him softly chuckled. Looks like there was going to be an entertaining show in a few days. Ezra Zephyr and Pele's match still ended up causing some slight ripples in the outer mountains of Alchemic Rune Peak. However, the disciples under Elder Song merely viewed it as a silly squabble that was not worth much attention. This was quite normal, because even in Elder Low's group, there weren't many who fancied Ezra's chances even if he was the latest champion of the peak selection ceremony. At the end of the day, Pele was a true blue veteran senior disciple of the lower yellow grade, someone who was far more experienced than the newbie Ezra. See ndsnzvl.czm. In the eyes of many of the senior disciples, Ezra was merely asking for trouble. While many disciples held such thoughts, 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. Mist swirled around the pine trees, an enormous stone stage towering above them. There were 2 gold cauldrons placed on the opposite sides of the stage. At this current time, the vicinity of the stone stage was already filled with figures, even Elder Low already here, seated above them. Today was the duel between Ezra Zephyr and Pele, and Elder Low was naturally going to oversee it such as to prevent any accidents from occurring. Besides them, some of the disciples from the other imprint faction were also present, clearly waiting to enjoy the show. Of course, what they wanted to see was likely Ezra's suffering. After all, he had been in the limelight too much recently and was also the champion of the peak selection ceremony. However, he was also a new Outer Mountain disciple without enough experience. Thus, there were naturally people who were happy to see someone put him in his place. On one side of the stone stage, a smiling Pele was surrounded by several disciples, like a moon amongst the stars. He was pretty relaxed from the looks of it and did not treat today's match seriously at all. Crackle crackle. With a thundering rumble of lightning, a black figure jumped over from far away, eventually landing on the opposite end of the stone stage. It was Ezra with Sko, LL and Hattie at his side. He already registered them as his contracted martial animals. Elder Low nodded in response, a rather complicated look on his face. He truly did have high hopes for Ezra's potential, which was why he did not wish to see him clashing with Pele at such a time. However, he also understood that it was because he regarded Ezra with too much importance that the senior disciples were now unhappy, leading them to make things difficult for Ezra. But why couldn't these fools just stop for a moment and question themselves instead? If they had shown a little more worth, wouldn't he have no need to place all his bets on a single person? If Ezra lost today's duel, he would surely have to give in for a period of time and keep a low profile, losing all hopes of obtaining the Diamond Quarter. Without such resources, it would undoubtedly become even more difficult for him to catch up with the veteran Diamond Belt disciples. With such feelings churning in his heart, Elder Low ultimately sighed inside, nodding to Ezra before turning towards Pele. "This is a match between our own people, make sure you understand when to show respect." Pele laughed in a relaxed manner and replied, "Don't worry, Elder Low, I'm a senior after all and will spare the humiliation." The moment he finished, his figure moved, landing behind the gold cauldron of his side as he cast a playful gaze towards Ezra Zephyr and said, "Junior brother Ezra, you can avoid any suffering if you admit defeat now. It's never a pretty sight when your beautiful face is ruined by the nasty smoke of ruined ingredients." Ezra opened his mind. "Your breath stinks." With saying that, he also arrived behind the gold cauldron. He stood opposite Pele, his face akin to a still ancient well. When their gazes met, iciness flashed within their eyes. Below Elder Low, the Diamond Belt disciples were also watching. James Endoro wore a slight smile on his face as he said towards Mubarak, "Hee, senior brother Mubarak, I believe this junior brother of ours does have potential, but he has a bit of a rebellious streak and doesn't follow the rules. I hope that he will be able to better behave after today, and at the very least understand that he should be more respectful towards us senior brothers." Mubarak frowned upon hearing this. He was a gentle and magnanimous person, and although his talent was not exceptional, he did possess a substantial amount of influence among the disciples. He could sense the happiness on Elder Low's face due to Ezra's arrival, happiness that in turn made Mubarak blame himself and feel somewhat ashamed. Elder Low would not feel this way if he had been more capable as the first disciple. Thus, he showed goodwill towards Ezra Zephyr, because he genuinely hoped that someone amazing would arise from their group. Mubarak showed goodwill towards Ezra Zephyr, because he genuinely hoped that someone amazing would arise from their group. However, this mindset was clearly not shared by all the other disciples. James Endoro, for instance, disliked how much attention Elder Low was showing Ezra Zephyr. Although Pele appeared to be the mastermind, James was likely sparing no effort to support the former. Mubarak also knew that his junior brother James did not truly acknowledge him as the first disciple, because the latter's talent was greater than his own. Although James had joined later, he was fast catching up with his senior brother. Hence, he was usually not too respectful either when they met. "Junior brother James, junior brother Ezra has great potential, and it can be said to be our fortune that he has come to Alchemic Rune Peak and Elder Low's faction. The cultivation resources we give him now will surely be returned manyfold in the future," said Mubarak. James maintained his smiling appearance, though a sneer flashed in his eyes. Senior brother Mubarak's words may be slightly exaggerated. I do not deny that he does have potential, but I'm afraid that he is not qualified to be considered our fortune. So what if he's the champion of the peak selection ceremony? Would it cement his gradual ascent to one of the ranked disciples? It's not like we haven't seen any champions of the peak selection ceremony before, and quite a few of them only end up as diamond belt disciples after entering the inner mountains, making them slightly better than any of us. Mubarak frowned and said, Elder Low naturally has his reasons for placing such high hopes in Ezra Zephyr. Then we'll wait and see. James did not comment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he gazed at Ezra's figure on the stone stage and said in neither hurried nor slow manner, I hope that you can still have such a mindset after this match. No matter how much potential he has, it is irrelevant till the day he turns that potential into strength. As for now, I feel that it would be best for him to behave a little better. A little suffering may not always be a bad thing for youngsters. While they were conversing, Elder Low's gaze swept across the stone stage as he said in a solemn voice, Begin. The ingredients were already there, placed on a table not far from the cauldron. The competition was simple. The one who would concoct the youth-refreshing pill first is the winner. As soon as the match began, Pele poured his spiritual energy into the cauldron and the gold cauldron bottom stand ignited ablaze. Pele wasted no time and inserted the ingredients. Everlasting leaves, scales of glowing mermaid, mudberry, and rainbow tears. These were the ingredients necessary for the concoction of the youth-refreshing pill. Pele was doing his utmost best, even the watchers were admiring his talent. One by one, he refined and break the ingredients. Look, he also activated the cauldron. Yelled a disciple, and the eyes of the masses turned towards the man named Ezra Zephyr. The pyre roared beneath the cauldron and the Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom sent the 2 ingredients into the gold cauldron. Yes, just 2. Some leaves and water. What is he doing? Bob asked Blaze, to which the latter shook his head and replied. Beats me. At the same time, James laughed loudly. He didn't even read the ingredient scroll that Elder Low gave him and you are putting your hopes on him. There was no one who could answer to James's mock, not Mubarak nor Elder Low. Ezra did nothing and calmly watched the cauldron with a satisfied smile. Anticipation could be seen in the eyes of spectators. Soon, the cauldron's fire was extinguished and Ezra took out a cup from his bracelet. And slowly he poured the outcome of his actions into the cup. Is that tea? Did he make tea? What the hell is wrong with him? These were the remarks of many disciples who watched. CNDSLZVL? ZM Ezra, you have failed me, said Elder Low with gritted teeth. Serp. Ezra sipped the tea in an unmannered way. He did know the mannerism of a noble, but what he wanted to do at this moment was to irritate his haters as much as he can. Only after he finished taking his tea the werewolf prince moved. He gradually took his steps towards the table that had ingredients on it and threw it towards the cauldron from a distance. What? How dare he threw the ingredients? That can cause damage to them and eventually lead to a failed pill. Arrogant. Just too arrogant. On the other hand, the competitor of Ezra grinned at the sight. He was sure of his victory. There was no one in both realms who could convince him at this moment that he could lose. The cauldron was activated by Ezra once again and the blaze came out and covered the cauldron's bottom. Pele completed half of the concocting process, while Ezra had just started. But the prince did something strange, something that no one understood. I think you should take a look at. Crackle. The black bolts of lightning thundered and disturbed the pyre beneath the cauldron. The structure of the blazing fire changed and the fire turned into a tornado. A tornado of fire devoured the whole cauldron inside its belly. Seeing that everyone gasped, even Elder Low stood from his seat. His eyes widened as he asked himself, what is he watching? This, just what is this? Pele, who has completed half of the process, was also bewildered by the scorching tornado. Whoosh! With a giant gust, the tornado dispersed and something that floated in the belly of the tornado fell into the cauldron. The prince stepped forward and took it out. A shining pearl-like round thing was in his hand. He raised it high to show it to Elder Low. A youth-refreshing pill. He concocted the pill faster than Pele. How is this possible? This is unbelievable. He must have cheated somehow. Elder Low, kindly check. The disciples couldn't believe their eyes. The elder blinked a few times and floated until he reached Ezra. Ezra, did you cheat? He asked with a solemn look. His voice was weak. The prince replied. No, elder, I can do it in front of you. Do it, elder said. The prince nodded and began the process again. Pele on the other hand was still concocting. He considered Ezra's concoction as fraud and didn't stop his refining. He was about to finish his pill. Yes, just few more seconds. 9, 8. 7, 6. I finish. He heard Ezra's voice again. This time, Elder Low was present. He clearly saw that the tornado was caused by Ezra's spiritual energy. He quickly at the second pill Ezra made and his eyes widened in shock. It is indeed the youth refreshing pill. No way, Elder, are you mistaken? James yelled. Elder Low gave him an angry look and threw first concocting pill towards him. Check yourself. James gulped and ate it, but no response came out of him other than an astounded look on his face. After a while, he looked at Pele and said. You lose. What? How? No way. He retorted. Thanks for letting me win, junior brother. Ezra said calm expression, but he said the latter two words slowly and loudly. Fear and anger interlaced on Pele's face, which was not a pretty sight to look at currently. Such an outcome was something he had never even considered. Around the stone stage, all the disciples stared at Ezra Zephyr in amazement regardless of what faction they hailed from. There were no longer any gazes that questioned his actions, now replaced by a sliver of wariness. In the past, numerous senior disciples had not thought much of this champion of the peak selection ceremony. The prince was after all just a new disciple, and titles meant little. However, Ezra had now proven his worth to them. In the silence, Elder Low stroked his beard, a gratified smile appearing on his strict and aged face. Ezra's victory had also somewhat exceeded his expectations. He had originally been under the impression that Ezra was merely being rash, especially since youngsters were quite easily provoked. But from what he could see now, it was clear that he had underestimated Ezra. He was unsure how Ezra created that tornado and what else it could do, but he remained silent and thought to ask him in secret. Later, he softly chuckled as his gaze swept towards his disciples. Ezra Zephyr had won this battle. In accordance with the agreement, he shall be the third participant in the quarter match next month. Are there any of you who still has objections? Numerous disciples shook their heads. Elder Low nodded as he looked towards Ezra and said, Since that is the case, you shall be the third participant. In a month, you shall represent our faction and contest for the Diamond Quarter. Understood. Ezra Zephyr bowed slightly and responded. Elder Low and the rest of the new disciples cheered in excitement. Gil Subzi started dancing in front of the senior disciples. Ezra's battle made them feel proud as fellow new disciples. The corners of James' mouth twitched when he saw this. He knew that with this battle, Ezra had established a place for himself in the outer mountains. In the future, it was likely that not many disciples would respond if anyone were to attempt to suppress Ezra Zephyr based on seniority. After all, the strength Ezra displayed in this battle was enough to convince everyone. James's mood was ruined. He had originally intended for Pele to show Ezra Zephyr his place, and lessen his value in Elder Low's eyes. However, it had all been ruined by Ezra's strange control over the cauldron. The prince had ultimately managed to solidify his position. The result of Ezra and Pele's match swiftly spread in Alchemic Rune Peak, undoubtedly stirring up the waters. Many had originally believed this match to be an unimportant squabble that had been started by Ezra Zephyr. Even though the prince was the champion of the latest peak selection ceremony, it had been a competition only amongst the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples. Pele on the other hand was a veteran gold belt disciple and a formidable individual with lower yellow-grade alchemic status. These two were clearly not supposed to be on the same level. As such, many had dismissed the match with a laugh. But who could have expected the final result to turn out in such a manner? What? Ezra defeated Pele? Eiley was with junior disciples when she heard the news, disbelief immediately flooding her pretty face as she immediately asked, "How can it be? Did you make a mistake?" The disciple that had made the report merely smiled bitterly as he explained, "The news has already spread, and so many people have personally seen the battle. Ezra Zephyr has indeed defeated him. Rumors say he made 2 pills before Pele could make 1, and he even made tea before concocting those 2 pills." Eiley's face turned spicy hot with embarrassment. She was so certain of Ezra's defeat, hence this outcome was in truth quite shameful for her. "Hee, it seems that you've underestimated Ezra," a girl disciple said. Eiley gently gritted her teeth and snorted. Who knows whether Elder Lo's faction was just putting up a show? Elder Lo may have forced Pele to lose to Ezra. She was still unable to believe it. Ezra was not even an apprentice, right? How could he possibly beat lower yellow grade alchemist? The other disciple shook his head. "I understand Elder Lo's character. He's inflexible and stubborn, and no matter how highly he regards Ezra, he will never use such a method to help the latter." The disciple that had come to inform them also said, "It seems that Ezra used some strange way to handle the fire of Cauldron. He made a tornado of fire." Oh, the other lady was currently watering a plant, paused for a moment as she remarked in surprise, "This little guy does have some mystery in him. I have never heard about anyone controlling fire in that proficiency. I previously heard of Ezra's excellent comprehensive ability with regards to spiritual techniques, but I never imagined that it would be so superb in alchemy as well." He sighed. "CNDSLZVL?" Eiley pouted when she heard the senior disciple continuously praise Ezra. "If you think so highly of him, why didn't you force Elder Sonk to recruit him?" The young lady sighed. "At present, Blood Slaughterer Peak's momentum is practically unstoppable in our faction, and I no longer have the drive to vie with them. Elder Sonk is dancing on their palm as well, leaving only that stubborn Elder Lo, who is still unwilling to admit defeat. Since that is the case, why should I force him to join our corrupt faction? You can take it as me letting him hope. In that 1 in a million chance that Ezra Zephyr really does turn out to be an amazing genius blessed by the heavens, and manages to obstruct Blood Slaughterer Peak's invasion, it would be good for us too, because as things stand, we'll likely never be able to raise our heads again in the future." Eiley's pupils swiveled in thought as she said, "Since Ezra has defeated Pele, he will become one of the participants for the upcoming quarter match. Senior sister, who do you think will end up winning the Diamond Quarter?" The lady chuckled and answered, "Though Ezra is talented, he has after all only recently joined the Outer Mountains. It is likely that it took everything he had to defeat Pele this time. If my prediction is not wrong, he can only use that strange control to concoct lower yellow grade pill. His pills will collapse once he uses the same way to concoct a higher grade pill." Upon hearing this, the disciple who had come to report immediately said, "Senior sister has incredible foresight. It is indeed in the rumors that B can only concoct lower yellow grade youth refreshing pill. I'm of the opinion that if Elder Lo has chosen a different pill, then the winner would have been different." The lady nodded in agreement. "He's after all a newbie, making his experience lacking, so even if he replaces Pele, he would not be of much help to Elder Lo's side. I've heard that Elder Sonk is sending Kimba, Andrew, and Sliso. These 3 are certainly elites amongst his gold belt disciples, each one boasting incredible perception in runes, and may even be concealing their true talent. That's why even with Ezra Zephyr's sudden addition, Elder Sonk's side still has a better chance of victory. In such a situation, a mere newbie changes nothing." Only after hearing her senior sister speaking such words did Eiley finally nod in satisfaction. The lady could not help but laugh when she saw this. "He has never provoked or offended you. Why do you always seem so happy when things aren't going well for him?" Eiley was taken aback. With a tremble of a full bosom, she self-righteously said, "Well, no one asked him to be the champion of the peak selection ceremony." The lady helplessly shook her head. How could she not be aware of her junior sister's fancy for Sith Wiggins? The same Sith that was also once a champion of the peak selection ceremony. In Eiley's heart, no other champion could compare to Sith. Hence, for the sake of proving that she was not wrong, she would naturally adopt such an attitude towards Ezra. I think you should take a look at. The lady glanced at Eily and said, "You'd better not underestimate Ezra. No one can say for certain how the future will turn out. There may even come a day when he catches up to Sith Wiggins." She was definitely not happy about her junior's blind adoration of Sith. Hence, she was abnormally critical with regard to Sith Wiggins. However, upon hearing this, Eily disdainfully said, "Who knows how many geniuses there are who hope to catch up to Sith Wiggins? I'm afraid that Ezra will not be able to live up to such high expectations. Senior sister, it is impossible for that to happen. Moreover, it'd be better for him to think about how to handle the upcoming quarter match. He'd better not let the chance he worked so hard for end up being a humiliation fiesta. The quarter match will be nothing like the match between those under the same teacher. If he loses, the entire spirit-devouring mountain will know. That's pretty much going to be akin to losing all face. As for catching up to senior brother Sith Wiggins," Eily stealthily shifted to the entrance, before making a funny face at her senior. She slipped away in an instant, her voice echoing from afar as her figure disappeared into the distance. "Senior sister, you can keep daydreaming." The lady sighed in regret. "Ill-mannered lass." The outcome of the match also eventually made its way to the rest of Elder Sonk's faction. In a certain stone pavilion, Kimba was pouring tea. Andrew, Sliso, and several other disciples were seated beside Elder Sonk. Sliso remarked, "Elder Lo's group is becoming more and more pathetic. I can't believe that a new disciple managed to beat a veteran gold belt disciple. This Pele is really too incompetent." The more cautious Andrew slowly said, "The fact that Ezra Zephyr was able to defeat him likely means that he does have some insight into alchemy." Sliso laughed and said, "What insight can he have? I already know how the match went. He basically pulled some strange sorcery. Elder Lo probably did something with his cauldron. Because, once it is used, Ezra's cauldron ignited a tornado that engulfed the cauldron. Overall, he's like a one-trick pony." Andrew gave a slight nod. "If that is the case, there is nothing to fear. As long as that move is blocked, Ezra would become useless." His gaze turned, looking towards Kimba, who was still pouring tea, as he smiled and asked, "What are senior brother Kimba's thoughts?" Kimba toyed with the cup in his hand as a faint smile was revealed on his face. "No matter what games they're playing, they will not have any chances in the upcoming quarter match, because I've long had my eye on that diamond quarter." Though his voice was soft, there was a certain unshakable feeling to his words, as if they had already decided who the diamond quarter would ultimately belong to. However, neither Andrew nor Sliso raised any objections. Instead, gloating smiles appeared on their faces. "Looks like senior brother Kimba is serious. Fine, senior brother Kimba should take the diamond quarter and quickly get promoted. We've been drooling over the gold belt first seat for a long time." The two raised their cups and grinned. "Let's toast to senior brother Kimba's success." Kimba smiled slightly as his and their cups hit, before raising his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as he peered into the distance. "Bob, Blaze, and Ezra Zephyr." He shook his head as he chuckled softly. "Are just 3 pieces of trash." Swoosh. The prince landed on a small mountain. He was called by Elder Lo. "Greetings, Elder Lo," said Ezra. Elder Lo smiled and nodded and asked, "Do you know what is the dream place for alchemists?" The prince calmly replied, "Myriad Miracle Tower." Elder Lo was surprised. "How do you know?" "Senior brother Mubarak told me." "And it is the dream place for alchemists indeed, but it's hell for those who are not in Myriad Miracle Tower." "Why is that, Elder Lo?" Ezra asked. The old man in black stayed quiet for a moment and sighed before speaking again. "Being an alchemist is an honor. Alchemists are rarer than martial masters and rune masters. But look at us, we are also alchemists, but no one respects as much as we deserve." "Do you know the reason?" he asked as he looked at Ezra. "The same Myriad Miracle Tower?" the prince said with a questioning face. See NDSNZVL.CZM. Elder Lo was surprised when he heard this. Right answer, you know this too. Senior brother Mubarak told me this as well. He replied. Elder Low smiled and nodded his head. Did he tell you how Myriad Miracle Tower is stealing our glory? The prince shook his head. Senior brother didn't tell me that. Then let me tell you, alchemists are the backbones of this entire world. Without them, not only you cannot cure your disease, but you can neither progress faster. Many powerful entities lines up at the doors of famous alchemists to get some pills for their breakthrough. All the alchemists in this continent, apart from those who are independent and those who are affiliated with other bodies, belong to one of the 7 first-degree sects, Myriad Miracle Tower, the only sect who trains only alchemy, imprints, and armament craftsmanship. They train alchemists and send them all around the continent, but the disciple alchemist can only leave the sect after they take the oath that they will not spit the ingredients and way to concoct the pill even if they die. Because of this, no one in the continent knows the formulas of pills that the Myriad Miracle Towers concoct. They monopolize the pill business in an entire continent. They are so rich that they hire powerful independent martial masters. If you touch an alchemist of Myriad Miracle Tower, even if he is a lower yellow-grade alchemist, they will search for you in the depths of ocean to kill you. The prince calmly listened to everything, but his face was grave. Elder Low smiled gently. There is no way for alchemists of spirit-devouring mountain to gain such fame, but all I want is to be respected in our sect, and for that, we need to do something new. You have given me hope, Ezra. The way you manage that fire and effortlessly concoct the pill, I am bewildered. I know you are a bucket of secrets, however, I won't force you to spill the beans. Your secrets are yours to keep, but I, as the elder, request you to help the alchemy of our sect. Don't make me ashamed of myself, elder. How can you request an outer disciple like me? I'll tell you everything. Ezra said as he bowed. An evil grin appeared in his heart. Plan successful, boy. Fenrir congratulated. Several days quickly passed after the match between Ezra and Palais, while the rumors it caused gradually vanishing. After their initial shock, many disciples began to accept the result. The match was after all between those of the same faction, and did not have much to do with the other group. The main takeaway of those that had watched the match was that although Ezra had won, it had been with the help of Elder Low. However, even with the help, it is difficult to concoct. Therefore, most people felt they were equals. As such, the disciples under Elder Sunk basically did not care that Ezra had replaced Palais as the third participant in the quarter match. From what they could see, the ultimate result would not be any different regardless of whether it was Ezra or Palais. It was obvious that Elder Sunk's faction did not really view Elder Low's faction as a threat. In their eyes, the only difference there would be after Ezra replaced Palais was who would end up being humiliated. Hence, the attention on the prince only lasted for a few days before fading away, no one bothering to take any further notice of him. They knew that the halo currently over Ezra would naturally dissipate during the quarter match. I think you should take a look at. Yet another morning lesson in the Pill Seeker Hall. Ezra was seated on the mat with his eyes lightly shut. In front of him was placed a gold cauldron. In the large hall, other disciples would look over from time to time. However, there was no longer anyone who dared to object to Ezra's status as the gold belt third seat. Even Palais, who was right behind, had practically surrendered for the past few days, no longer daring to casually provoke the former. Ezra had clearly succeeded in establishing his position through the duel with Palais. The hall was silent for a long time. Only after everyone completed their lecture session did hushed whispers begin to spread. At the highest seat, Elder Low cast his gaze downwards, sweeping past Bob, Blaze, and Ezra Zephyr as he slowly said, "There are still 13 days till the quarter match." Every gaze in the hall immediately converged towards the trio. "Are you three confident?" Upon hearing Elder Low's question, Bob and Blaze hesitated somewhat, not knowing how to reply. After all, they knew all three individuals from Elder Sunk's side were not simple at all, especially Kimba. He was an expert in imprints. "Elder Low, we will give our all in battle," said Bob in the end, but anyone could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Elder Low frowned, somewhat unsatisfied by this answer. However, he understood that Bob and Blaze were facing a tremendous amount of pressure. After all, the disciples under Elder Sonk were indeed of higher quality than them, and they even had the legacy left behind their predecessors. Even more disciples secretly shook their heads and sighed inside. The truth was that even they did not fancy the chances of their team. As for Ezra, nobody paid much attention to him. Although he had defeated Pele, the latter was slightly less talented than Bob and Blaze. Since the two of them had already declared their views, everyone believed that Ezra would only be tagging along. However, it was not because anyone looked down on him, but because it would be the same even if it was Pele. If the three of you have any problems or needs in your research, you may feel free to find me directly," offered Elder Low. At such a time, he could only give them as much convenience as possible, and hope that they would succeed in raising their insight. A slight look of joy was revealed on Bob and Blaze's faces as they hurriedly acknowledged in a respectful manner. In contrast, the prince fell into thought for a moment, before attempting to probe. "Elder Low, I've recently been thinking about something ever since I concocted the pill. I have created a formula of youth refreshing pill where we can get 5 times more result only by changing temperature and single ingredient." Since Elder Low had initiated, Ezra decided there was no need to be courteous, and immediately struck while the iron was hot. Before Elder Low could respond, James smiled faintly and said, "Isn't junior brother Ezra being too ambitious? The youth refreshing pill is a lower yellow grade pill. Wouldn't an increase of 5 times make it a middle yellow grade pill? Let alone gold belt disciples, even none of the diamond belt disciples have ever created a new pill. In my opinion, junior brother Ezra should put your efforts into learning what Elder Low is teaching. The opponents you meet in the quarter match are no ordinary individuals after all. We do not have enough time for childish experiments. If your new formula that came out of God knows where doesn't work, you will no longer have any energy to continue the match." Other disciples also broke out into whispers, somewhat in agreement with James's words. They clearly understood just how stringent Ezra's idea was. They all believed that he thinks highly of himself after defeating Pele. This also made them suspect that Ezra was taking the opportunity to profit from Elder Low's offer. Of course, it was mainly because they were quite jealous. It was a new pill formula with 5 times the effect. The prince merely glanced at James, paying no heed to the latter's words as he looked towards Elder Low. "The formula for a new pill, huh?" Elder Low was slightly taken aback. He pondered for quite a while and then said, "You do know how to find opportunities. Now I have become curious about the new formula you have created." Elder Low looked towards Ezra and asked, "Are you confident in concocting the new version of youth refreshing pill?" The prince calmly answered, "Without any failure, Elder Low." James Endoro laughed upon hearing this, and was just about to speak up again. However, Elder Low waved his hand, gazing deeply at Ezra as he said, "Since that is so, I will naturally give you my full support. I will help you collect the ingredients." The corners of James's mouth twitched. He had not expected Elder Low to agree to Ezra Zephyr's rather outrageous request. Ordinary disciples, and even diamond belt disciples like them, were not given such treatment all the time. Feeling rather oppressed inside, James could only glance at Ezra with a forced superficial smile as he said, "Junior brother Ezra, please do not let Elder Low down. I hope that we will be able to open our eyes during the quarter match and show all of us fellow brother disciples the new version of the pill that you've created. Don't waste the alchemy ingredients you're given." Some of the disciples that were closer to James sniggered inside. He was clearly putting Ezra on a pedestal. If the latter was unable to show them anything during the quarter match, the other disciples would likely think that he was purely taking advantage, which would in turn lower his reputation. "Don't worry, senior brother James. I will not fail to shut your mouth. I mean, see enemy's mouth," Ezra Zephyr said with a wicked smirk on his face. His scarlet eyes glowed. At the sight of Ezra's seemingly untouchable appearance, James could only coldly snort inside. Elder LK looked towards the prince and suddenly raised his hand. A speck of light descended, which was received by Ezra. The speck of light turned out to be a token, on which a giant black mountain had been carved. On the mountain's body was an unbroken mountain range dotted with quarters. This is? The prince was puzzled. Elder Low explained, this is your reward for the peak selection ceremony, a slot for the divine spirit ablution. Oh? The divine spirit ablution is open? Ezra was excited. He had been looking forward to it for quite some time. Elder Low nodded. It will formally open tomorrow. Only the diamond belt of the various peaks has the right to enjoy the divine spirit ablution once every 5 months, making it a grand event of sorts. Tomorrow, you will follow Mubarak and the rest there. The prince looked towards Mubarak, who responded with a warm smile. In turn, the prince of Bloodfang Kingdom nodded. After giving a few more instructions, Elder Low waved his hand, indicating for the disciples to disperse. The prince grasped the tokens in his hands as curiosity and anticipation flooded into his eyes. He had been looking forward to this divine spirit ablution for a long time, and it was finally here at last. As he kept the token, he mumbled to himself. I hope that the divine spirit ablution will not disappoint. Divine spirit ablution, why do I get the feeling that it has something familiar in it? Pondered Fenrir. Ezra read his thoughts and replied. Don't worry, you will see it with your eyes soon. I think you should take a look at. Ezra arrived with Sko, LL and Hattie at the gathering point. He saw that Mubarak, James Endoro, and the other few Diamond Belt disciples were already waiting there. With the exception of Mubarak, the other Diamond Belt disciples wore nonchalant expressions that gave off a slight air of superiority. They were after all Diamond Belt disciples, a status that far surpassed a Gold Belt disciple like Ezra Zephyr. However, although they were pretty much impassive towards Ezra, the expressions in their eyes began to warm a little when they saw 2 cubs on Ezra's shoulders. Cerulean and crimson-colored cubs, each sitting on one side of Ezra. However, a ray of dominance could be felt from those 2 cubs. The crimson one had his eyes shut as if he didn't care about anything, while the cerulean one was growling at every other disciple with nothing but hatred in his eyes. Mubarak gulped and forced a smile at Ezra and said, Since you guys are here, let's prepare to make a move. The prince responded with a smile and a nod. Mubarak waved his sleeve and a cloud of spiritual energy arrived and everyone sat on it. The cloud brought the group into the sky and began flying in a certain direction. Martial cultivators could only fly when they reached the foundation establishment stage, and for martial sorcerers, they had to establish the 5th circle. These stages were also the requirement needed for an outer mountain disciple to become an inner mountain disciple. Anyone below that will remain as an outer mountain disciple and have to use spiritual clouds to travel around. While they were flying past Pill Seeker Hall, another spiritual cloud rose from the ruined Seeker Hall. Atop the clouds were the Diamond Belt disciples from the other faction. On that cloud was also a familiar lady, Eiley. With her hot body, she was also quite an attention-grabbing sight. She was an enchanting beauty. In front of her was the leader of the imprint faction, Lopap. They had the most Diamond Belt disciples of the 2 groups and thus gave off a strong and impressive aura. Hence, they audaciously looked towards Elder Low's group without reservation, several disciples constantly casting their gazes at the only Gold Belt disciple, Ezra. CDSLsvel.czm Mubarak shot an angry glance at them but did not intend on clashing with them here. With a stomp of his foot, the spiritual energy cloud sped up, rapidly leaving them behind. Giant peak after peak thrust into the clouds on the vast land, the flying clouds occasionally zipping past in the sky. The calls and chirps of various birds filled the place, and one would even catch sight of squads of disciples in black flying past high in the sky in orderly formations. They were the enforcement disciples of the outer mountains. The entire place gave off a busy vibe. While they were traveling, Mubarak advised Ezra, Junior brother, the divine spirit ablution opens every 5 months, and lasts for 10 days each time. You should take note of the time you have. The prince curiously asked, Senior brother, what exactly is this divine spirit ablution? Mubarak did not answer, and merely said, You'll know once we reach our destination. All the prince could do was nod his head. An hour later, the spiritual energy cloud under their feet finally began to slow. The prince raised his head and looked to the front as if sensing something, only for his heart to tremble involuntarily. To their front stood majestic mountains akin to pillars that were supporting the heavens, connecting the sky and land. Between the mountains flowed vast, gigantic rivers. From above, it looked as if an endless basilisk was twisting and coiling around them. An indescribable aura dashed into the sky, making one feel as if the faint hiss of basilisk was echoing across the land. The prince and the rest landed on one of the mountains. Before the giant mountains and rivers that separate them, the group was as tiny as ants. The spiritual here is so pure. Ezra suddenly discovered that the spiritual energy around him was extremely pure, beating even the gold quarter of his. You are correct, boy, the spiritual energy here is abnormal, as if something is attracting or creating an abundance of spiritual energy. The amount does not enter the realm of the mother tree in your kingdom, but still, it works the same way. Fenrir gave his thoughts. Hearing him, Ezra went into deep ponder about the progress of his homeland. The area was blanketed in swirling mists, making it appear rather hazy, mists that would only appear when the spiritual energy in the area was extremely pure. Ah, it's because of the rivers. Fenrir spoke. Ezra's eyes narrowed when he heard that and gazed at the wide rivers that snaked between the giant peaks. He had seen mist continuously rise from the rivers and blend into the air. However, he also felt a peculiar pressure when he gazed at the basilisk-like rivers, making fear involuntarily bubble up in his heart. It seemed that these rivers were not ordinary at all. This is where the divine spirit ablution is held. Mubarak grinned at Ezra as he pointed to the vast rivers. At this current moment, a seemingly endless stream of spiritual energy was descending from the sky, landing on the various mountains. Junior brother, these rivers are no ordinary rivers. They originate from mystery turf that happened to open in our spirit-devouring mountain long ago. Mystery turf? Ezra was curious about this new name. There is a saying amongst the martial masters, the one who obtains the mystery turf will obtain all that is under the upper realm. As of what is a mystery turf and why it has so many treasures in it is unknown. The main reason why our sect's spiritual energy is so rich, and can construct numerous energy mountains for our training, is because there is a mystery turf named Mountain Duct below us that provides an endless amount of spiritual energy. This mountain duct is the second bedrock on which our spirit-devouring mountain is built. The first one is, of course, the demonic mountain. Ezra squinted his eyes. He is someone who knew almost everything. Fenrir, what is a mystery turf? The monstrous wolf of Norse remained quiet for quite a while before saying. It's very complicated, boy. But one thing is certain, it is from a different realm, completely different from the lower realm and the upper realm. Throughout history, numerous wars occurred in the upper realm, and many great figures of mythologies perished over the rights of a small mystery turf. I think you should take a look at. The power of mystery turf varies, some are too valuable, while other are average and few comes with poor benefits. For example, the spirity bailiwick in your possession is also a mystery turf. However, it's less valuable than this one called Mountain Duct. Ezra's heart shook violently, shocked as he gazed at the flowing basilisk-like rivers before him. No wonder he had felt an indescribable pressure. It turns out that these rivers belong to an unknown realm. Unbelievable. His eyes began to burn with excitement as he mumbled. I'm starting to look more and more forward to the divine spirit ablution. The prince and the rest stood on a mountain peak, their gazes directed to the front where the rivers meandered through giant mountain after mountain, ultimately flowing into a giant lake. There seemed to be no end to this lake, in which also stood several sky-kissing pillar-like mountains. The mountains split the lake into sections, making it seem akin to a maze when covered by the mists. Mubarak pointed at the seemingly endless mist-covered lake and said, "This is the energy reservoir and where divine spirit ablution will be held." Although it is called a reservoir, it is extremely vast, so calling it a sea won't be an exaggeration. Ezra's eyes fell upon the so-called energy reservoir as his expression turned serious. He could feel a certain pressure inside it that made fear rise in one's heart, not daring to enter its waters. He knew that this was likely due to the mystery turf, see the mountain duct. It could be said to be a gathering of spiritual energy that was born from the land and naturally possessed a certain natural pressure. He raised his head and saw the faint outline of an enormous imprint boundary that descended from the sky like a dome, enveloping the entire spiritual reservoir. This was an important place in the spirit-devouring mountain and was naturally tightly guarded. Uevelust.com. Who made this rune boundary? Ezra asked with an interesting spark in his eyes. Peak Master Jason Felleter, replied Mubarak in a sad voice. Ezra simply nodded, but he was wondering how powerful that person would be if he was alive. See NDSLZVL? ZM. Countless spiritual energy clouds were landing in the vicinity of the energy reservoir, clearly the disciples from the other peaks. However, what surprised Ezra was that the majority were not Diamond Belt disciples. Mubarak explained, the spiritual energy in the vicinity of the energy reservoir is extremely concentrated. Although the other disciples do not have the qualifications to enter, they will benefit substantially from training at the edge of the reservoir. The prince smiled and asked, Senior Brother Mubarak, it should be time to tell me about the divine spirit ablution, right? Mubarak nodded and pointed towards the energy reservoir. The most important thing you should take note about the divine spirit ablution is the duct creation energy. It is a mysterious existence that is born from the condensation of spiritual energy from the mountain duct. Duct creation energy? How do I obtain it? Ezra Zephyr was hooked. Near the mountain duct, Ezra Zephyr stood with his head full of questions. Mubarak smiled and gave the answer. It is obviously found in the energy reservoir, but in accordance with the rules, the disciples taking part in the ablution need to rely on their own abilities to find it. The energy reservoir originates from the mountain duct and is filled with a peculiar pressure. One needs to constantly circulate one's spiritual energy to withstand the pressure, making it a very taxing search. In addition, the energy reservoir may seem calm on the surface, but it is filled with danger. Due to the overflowing duct creation energy from the mountain duct, the energy that leaks from it turns into various kinds of duct creatures that will give you a headache when you encounter them in the reservoir. However, because these duct creatures are made from mountain duct, if you manage to hunt them, you'll be able to obtain duct creation energy from their bodies. The bigger the creature, the purer the duct creation energy. Mubarak smiled and said, Why else do you think the energy reservoir opens for 10 days each time? It's because everyone spends the majority of the first 9 days searching, while the divine spirit ablution is held on the 10th day. Today can be said to be a grand occasion of our spirit-devouring mountain, which happens once every 5 months. Practically all of the Diamond Belt disciples will be coming to search for duct creatures and engage in the divine spirit ablution. It's after all something that only Diamond Belt disciples get to enjoy, and no one would easily let this chance slip by. He extended a finger and pointed at the sky above the energy reservoir. Ezra's gaze followed and saw an island floating in the air. The island was somewhat similar to an altar, with numerous old and simple stone pillars adorning it. That is the ablution altar, and the stone pillars on it are called ablution pillars. On the 10th day, the disciples will head there to borrow the power of the ablution pillars to activate the mountain duct, ultimately completing the ablution. Ezra's gaze filled with interest as he looked at the giant altar in the sky. In addition, the divine spirit ablution is also divided into different ranks. When the mountain duct is activated during the ablution, basilisk-like paths will appear and coil around the body of the martial master. Hence, the rank of the ablution is based on how many paths appear. For example, if only one path appears, it will be considered a one-duct ablution, the lowest-ranked ablution. The highest is the 9 ducts ablution, where 9 basilisk-like paths will appear. Naturally, the higher the rank, the greater the benefits. Thus, to obtain a higher-ranked baptism, you'll have to work hard to search for duct creation energy, because the amount you collect will determine the rank of your ablution. Explained Mubarak. 9 basilisk-like paths. An intense look of interest flitted across the prince's eyes. Senior brother, what rank do you usually obtain? I think you should take a look at. Mubarak awkwardly scratched his head. I don't really stand out amongst the Diamond Belt disciples of the outer mountains, and can't last for too long in the energy reservoir, which limits the amount of duct creation energy I managed to find. All of my past ablutions have only reached the 3-pass rank. Some of the stronger Diamond Belt disciples are capable of reaching 4 paths. I've heard that Lopap from Elder Sonk's faction has achieved 4 paths every ablution. If we talk about the 5 and 6 pass ablutions, I'm afraid that only the ranked disciples can reach it. Ezra's gaze flashed. What about the top 10 rankers in Outer Mountains? Mubarak could not help but chuckle. Junior brother Ezra's ambition is not small, however, the top 10 do not need to so painstakingly search for dragon creation energy in the reservoir, because the sect will bestow them a small section of the energy reservoir for their personal use. They can enter it any time they want, and the divine spirit ablution produced inside is much greater than in other places. However, we are martial masters later and alchemists first. Divine spirit ablution only helps in martial prowess, it has nothing to do with alchemy, and that's exactly why everyone should avoid meaningless fights, especially you, junior brother. As expected of the top 10 rankers, such treatment was deserving. Ezra was momentarily overwhelmed, unable to hold back his wicked grin later. The advantages of the top 10 rankers were truly enviable. To think that they would even be allocated their own personal section of the Genesis reservoir. Compared to the other disciples, they were the ones who received the full support of the sect. Indeed, this sect only worships strong. He said to himself. CDSLsvel.czm, however, as the ones who had distinguished themselves from amongst the many disciples, they were indeed deserving of such treatment. Mubarak also sighed as he nodded. That's why they need not put much effort into finding duct creation energy for their ablution to easily reach the 7-pass rank. However, if they wish to attain an even higher rank, they would have to personally venture into the depths of the energy reservoir to hunt the 1,000-feet-long duct creatures. Only by taking them from the bodies of such beasts would their ablution reach the 8th path rank. Most of the duct creatures in the energy reservoir were about 100 feet long. It was said that the larger the beasts' bodies, the purer the duct creatures. After one reaches the 7 paths rank, one would have to go after the 1,000-feet duct beasts in order to ascend to greater heights. The prince fell into thought for a brief moment, before he inquired, how strong are the 1,000-feet duct beasts? When James heard this from the side, he laughed softly and said, Junior brother Ezra, there's no need for you to consider such matters. You are an alchemist, don't waste your time on martial master stuff. Hello, my editor is on vacation, he needed a break so I am on my own and Grammarly. Forgive a mistake or two if you see one and comment so that I can fix it. James felt that Ezra was forgetting his place by dreaming the impossible, so he continued. And just so you know, a 1,000-feet duct beast is an existence that even many rankers can only run from. There are very few people who had killed it throughout the years, there is only one person in recent few decades who has been able to hunt a 1,000-feet duct beast and enjoy the 8th path ablution. Oh, who? Asked Ezra with a slight smile, paying no attention to the thorns in James's words. James slowly answered, who else but the inner mountain ranker Sith Wiggins? Sith Wiggins. The prince's eyes trembled slightly. This name was akin to thunder even for a new Outer Mountain disciple like himself. This senior brother Sith Wiggins of his had left quite a number of legends in the spirit-devouring sect. A dangerous possibility appeared in his mind. Is he from the upper realm? As someone who could raise the divine spirit ablution to the 8-pass rank, it seems that Sith was indeed very capable. Although the prince had yet to meet these duct creatures, a 1,000-feet duct beast that the other rankers could do nothing about was definitely not going to be easy to deal with. Junior brother Ezra, although you only have one chance for now, you should make sure to properly grasp it. It will be great if you manage to earn 4 paths of ablution. Consoled James. The prince smiled and nodded in response. While they were talking, a disturbance suddenly began to spread in the area, countless male disciples peering towards the distance with bubbling excitement. The prince and the rest were also sensed something was going on and immediately raised their heads in curiosity. They caught sight of a spiritual energy cloud descending from the sky, landing on a mountain far away. Skirts of all colors fluttered on the spiritual energy cloud as sweet and melodious voices spread from it. It had evidently been ferrying many girls. At the very front, a young lady in white gracefully stood. A breeze blew past, making her fine black hair dance in the air, the sun shining down on an absolutely stunning face. Flower patterns extended from the fringes of her skirt. Her features were extremely delicate, endowed with beauty that could cause the downfall of nations. On her clean forehead was a mole, which gave her a noble look. However, an iciness that kept everyone else 1,000 miles away spread from the girl wearing a white skirt, like an unapproachable goddess of ice. Even so, her radiance was dazzling. Though there were many pretty girls around her, they did not seem to glow as much as they should, appearing dull in comparison. Amazement flitted across Ezra's eyes when he saw her because based on appearance and presence, the girl in a white skirt did not lose to Mahi in Gale or Ravina in Gale by much. Moreover, the lady in front was quite similar to the later, both the cold and distant kind that kept others 1,000 miles away. The prince had already guessed her identity. According to the information he received, there was only one person in the outer mountains of Spirit-Devouring Mountain whose appearance could make so many male disciples go crazy. Who else could it be but the fourth-ranked Ella Abella? This lady was the fourth strongest disciple in the outer mountains. Ella Abella. I can't believe that she's here too. Atop a certain mountain, Mubarak. James and the rest gazed from afar at the stunning and graceful figure standing on another peak, surprise appearing on their faces. Each of the top 10 rankers owned a small land in the energy reservoir, and could thus enter any time they wanted, not needing to wait for the reservoir to open every 5 months like everyone else. Therefore, they almost never chose to squeeze in with the others during this period. Hence, Ella's appearance was pretty unexpected for the group. So, that girl is Ella Abella. Ezra was also looking at the pretty figure. As a male, he was naturally somewhat curious about the individual said to be the #1 beauty of the sect in younger generations. From what he could see, she was indeed a wonder of sorts. Swish! However, just as the numerous disciples began their work, the sound of rushing wind was once again heard from far away in the sky. A dark green spiritual energy cloud descended from the sky and landed on one of the mountaintops, drawing countless gazes over. The cloud dispersed, revealing a slim figure. It was a young man in black, his black hair scattered over his shoulders. He had a defined, chiseled look, but what stood out the most were his eyes. They were pitch black like ink, akin to a pair of black stones, and appeared rather enigmatic. He was a better-looking version of Ezra Zephyr. One could just barely make out the sword-like runes on the black sleeves that gently fluttered as a breeze blew past, as an indescribably sharp and formidable sword spiritual energy spread from his body, making it seem as if the cry of a sword was ringing across the area. When he stood there, it felt as if he was not a human, but an unsheathed divine sword. The eyes of countless female disciples began to glow as they passionately gazed at the youth in black. Ezra Zephyr's also looked towards the youth in black as his expression turned somewhat serious. Just looking at the latter made him feel a slight stabbing pain in his eyes, because the spiritual energy in the latter's body was just too sharp. In the Spirit-Devouring Mountain, only those from Blood Slaughterer Peak would possess such sharp Genesis chi. Therefore, the identity of the youth in black was already clear as day. Ezra Zephyr asked in a low voice, "He is the #3 of the top 10 rankers, Wilson Sallow?" Mubarak nodded with a similarly serious expression. "That's right. He is Wilson Sallow." In the face of such an individual, even diamond belt disciples like them felt enormous pressure. However, the prince was calm and was smirking. While they were still in shock due to Wilson's appearance, another spiritual energy cloud descended from the sky. Atop the cloud was a young man wearing robes on which countless ancient runes had been inscribed. The runes alternated between glowing and dimming as unique undulations spread. The youth in robes wore a warm smile on his face, looking like quite the handsome young chap as his clothes fluttered in the breeze. The man with robes moved with grace. The Arcane Wizardry Peaks Govern, ranked 10th. At the sight of the youth in robes, anger filled Mubarak's expression. The prince saw the visible hatred and asked, "Who is he?" Mubarak gritted his teeth and replied, "He was once a treasured disciple of our alchemic rune peak. He was a genius in drawing imprints, but then he left and joined arcane wizardry peak. Not only he betrayed us, but he started to disrespect our peak as well." The prince looked at him with examining eyes. He squinted his eyes and murmured, "He is an elf." At the same time, Mubarak spoke again. His tone was slightly louder. "What's going on today? To think that 3 of the top 10 outer mountain rankers have come." The other disciples looked at each other, everyone puzzled. If it was just Ella, it could still be a coincidence, but when 3 of the 10 arrived at the same time, this matter was no longer as simple as it appeared. "Ignorant, have none of you heard the news?" While they were confused, a clear voice was suddenly heard from behind. Mubarak and the rest turned their heads and saw Aili walking over with her group. "Hee, does Junior's sister know?" asked Mubarak with a chuckle. Aili's gaze swept across the group, before she slowly said, "I've heard from my grandfather that traces of a 1,000 feet ducked beast were discovered some time ago in the energy reservoir. Wilson Sallow, Ella Abella, and Govern should be here because of it." 1,000 feet ducked beast. Astonishment was revealed on the faces of Mubarak and the rest. 1,000 feet ducked beasts usually hid in the deepest depths of the reservoir, making them exceedingly difficult to find. To think that one would reveal itself at such a time. No wonder Wilson, Ella, and Govern had chosen to come. After all, if they managed to hunt that 1,000 feet ducked beast, they would be able to enjoy the 8 paths of ablution. The other rankers are either in secluded prowess or out for missions. If not, there would likely be even more of them present. Aili smiled as she continued, "Of course, these new rankers can harvest because senior brother Sith Wiggins is already in the inner mountains. If not, there would be nothing left for the others to do." She was still the same Sith Wiggins fanatic. Mubarak chuckled as he looked towards the 3 figures. "It seems that the divine spirit ablution will be quite entertaining this time. The 8 paths of ablution is a grand affair after all. Even if we can't enjoy it, it will be a nice eye-opening experience." He looked towards Ezra, finding that the latter was still staring at the 3 figures, and immediately patted his shoulders. "Junior brother, there is no need to envy them. In the future, you may also have a chance to taste that 8 paths of ablution." His words were originally intended to console Ezra Zephyr, but when Aili heard them, she rolled her eyes and said, "In the current spirit-devouring mountain, only senior brother Sith has the ability to attain the 8 paths of ablution, and even the other rankers have never succeeded." She was implying that since the other rankers were unable to achieve it, what qualifications did he have as a gold belt disciple? Mubarak felt a little embarrassed. Aili was really blunt when she spoke. The prince ignored him at first, but then his mood swung. "You." He pointed his finger at Aili. The latter looked back and asked, "What?" This was enough to bewilder everyone from Alchemic Rune Peak. "BBZZZ." Before she or any other could say anything, a strange sound suddenly echoed across the area. Next, all of the disciples watched in excitement as the enormous dome of light around the energy reservoir gradually began to turn translucent. Mubarak excitedly exclaimed, "The energy reservoir is opening." Besides his excitement, he also planned to change the situation Ezra just created by diverting their attention to the reservoir. He then looked towards Ezra and said, "Junior brother, the reservoir is covered in mist and divided into many parts by the mountains. You'll be on your own when you go searching for duct creation energy." The prince smiled and nodded. Under the excited gazes of the numerous disciples, the dome of light in the sky grew fainter and fainter, before ultimately fading away. The instant it did so, endless pure spiritual energy surged out. It was as if the entire land had been cleaned, giving it a fresh new look. However, almost no one paid any attention, numerous disciples shooting forward at this moment, spiritual energy turning into clouds under their feet as they swarmed towards the reservoir within the mist. On their respective mountain tops, Wilson, Ella, and Govern also turned into flashes of light as they flew forth, disappearing in the mist in a few breaths. "Let's get going." Mubarak grinned at the prince and the rest. In the next instant, they too jumped into the sky and merged into the swarm of humans. Under the envious gazes of the countless disciples that were not qualified to enter, they charged into the endless energy reservoir. When Ezra's figure charged into the misty energy reservoir, the token in his hand suddenly shook, before combusting and swiftly turning to ashes. The sight of this caused the prince to think for a moment. A split second earlier, he had felt something sweep through him before the token began to combust. If his guess was not wrong, it should be due to the imprint boundary that surrounded the energy reservoir. Without a token in one's possession, one would likely be flung away. At this moment, Ezra was standing in the cloud above the reservoir, while an endless stream of glowing figures flew past them, heading towards every possible direction. Mubarak, James, and the rest had also split up after entering, evidently planning on searching for duct creation energy on their own. Searching for duct creation energy was a relatively personal matter, and the majority preferred to conduct this activity alone. This was to prevent any allocation problems or other disputes from occurring, which would only cause more inconvenience. However, there was no need for Ezra to take such measures. His strength alone was enough. None of his subordinates managed to arrive. He was also an exception. He could only trust his own back in the reservoir. "We should also find a spot for ourselves and find out how to search for the duct creation energy." Ezra smiled at the two cubs on his shoulders. Spiritual energy rose from under Ezra's feet. The cloud moved and took him in a random direction. The energy reservoir was extremely vast, with numerous giant heaven pillar-like mountains towering within it. These giant peaks were akin to the tall walls of a stronghold, leaving one no choice but to make long detours, making the reservoir an enormous maze. The prince flew for half an hour before gradually slowing down. He found a valley next to the reservoir waters and landed in it. On a rock next to the water, he stretched out his hand to test its temperature. "See NDSLZVL? ZM. This place is not bad. Ezra, you'll have to become one of the rankers so that you'll receive a personal portion of the energy reservoir. Then you'll be able to come here whenever you want a bath." The prince sighed. "So the biggest benefit of becoming one of the rankers for me is to come here for a bath?" "Yeah, sure. As for now, I'll go inside the reservoir to have a look." The prince was clearly somewhat eager as he cast his gaze towards the misty, mysterious sea. Ezra did not delay, leaping directly into the waters. Once he entered, he felt his body grow heavier, as if he had jumped into a swamp. The waters of the reservoir originate from that mountain duct, and hence contain a natural pressure that makes it extremely heavy. It's going to be very taxing on my spiritual energy to swim inside it. Ezra Zephyr was already prepared. With a thought, the chaos force in his core whizzed out and wrapped around his body with a loud thundering clap. MHM. The moment his spiritual energy appeared, the prince's eyes widened in amazement. In that split second earlier, he had felt the pressure from the water weaken substantially. The feeling of heaviness also vanished, making him feel as if he was a fish in water. What's going on? This unforeseen situation kind of confused Ezra. He had not heard Mubarak mention anything about this. To think that spiritual energy would have the power to block the pressure from the mountain duct. The prince frowned as he fell into deep thought. Even Finri was currently answerless. It was a long time later before he looked towards the black lightning swirling around him. His heart trembled a little. Could it be, because my spiritual energy is not chi nor mana but force, a type of spiritual belonging to martial animals? Not only that, Ezra's spiritual energy exists after devouring countless types of spiritual energies. Not even Ezra fully knew the wonders of his spiritual energy. This was the only conjecture Ezra had come up with. If not, he could not explain why the pressure from the energy reservoir did not affect him. In the end, to get himself tied up over such details, especially since it was a good thing for him anyways. Without the pressure, his spiritual energy consumption in the reservoir would be far less than the others, giving him a huge advantage. With such thoughts in mind, Ezra decided not to tarry any longer. His figure moved, swiftly swimming towards the depths of the reservoir. As he swam deeper, he discovered the presence of a faint mist inside the reservoir. Fortunately, he could still have his bearings, due to his high senses. After swimming for a long time, Ezra's body suddenly paused, because he had felt a faint wave. It came from under some giant boulders below him. His figure gradually descended, landing on one of the boulders, and stomped on it with one of his feet. The boulder immediately shattered as a thumb-sized ball of light slowly began to rise. The prince grabbed it and curiously uncurled his fingers. A thumb-sized white crystal floated on his palm, a drop of golden liquid inside it. The liquid appeared to be extremely viscous, slowly squirming about as if it was alive while giving off peculiar undulations. Is this the duct creation energy? Ezra observed the drop of viscous fluid. If he was not wrong, it should be the most important item for the divine spirit ablution, the duct creation energy. But this is a little too diluted, the prince awkwardly scratched his head. According to Mubarak, even the lowest path of ablution would require at least several dozen drops of duct creation energy. Ezra retrieved a bottle from his bracelet and placed the energy inside. However, while the prince was engaged in this task, the water behind him rippled faintly. A faint silhouette stealthily crept out from the rocks as a somewhat translucent 100 feet look beast appeared behind him. The beast's eyes greedily stared at Ezra's figure, as if it was looking at something delicious. Next, it opened its giant mouth and lunged towards the prince. Swish! The moment the creature moved, a bluish slash wrapped with black lightning cleaved through the water, bringing with it astonishing slicing power as it instantaneously cut the beast's head. NOV-Lusby.com. Ezra turned around and gazed at the somewhat translucent giant beast. Is this the duct beast born from the energy of that mountain duct? The prince observed the heavily injured creature that was still desperately struggling. It was about 100 feet long, and the prince estimated its strength to be at the second-level core formation stage. However, Ezra was slightly taken aback when he saw its eyes because he realized that it was staring at him with extreme desire, still continuously opening its mouth to bite at him, as if itching to swallow him. Ezra looked at the duct beast. Aren't these duct beasts not supposed to have any intelligence, and move according to instinct? The prince was quite puzzled, but the greed and desire in the duct creature's eyes was just too clear. Were its instincts really telling it to eat him? He had never heard senior brother Mubarak mention anything like this. Ezra frowned, but could not be bothered to put too much thought into it. His hand grasped around the handle of Efsa, the short sword, as spiritual energy spouted out from his body. Swish! The 100-foot-long body was instantly divided, a shockwave sweeping outwards as white light began to rise. Ezra caught the white light, and it transformed into a white crystal in his hand. It was the same duct creation energy crystal as earlier, but appeared thicker and more sturdier than the previous one, while the drop of it within was also a little more concentrated. After keeping it, Ezra did not linger any further, turning his body to continue his search. It was not long before he stopped once again because he had seen the water to his front rippling as giant duct beast after beast slowly appeared, surrounding him. Ezra grinned. Black bolts appeared at the bottom of the reservoir like the wrath of God, tearing through the water as menacing 100 feet duct beast after the beast was instantly cut to pieces. Ezra wielded the Efsa. With a jerk of hand, Efsa connected with Gleipnit and acted like a sharp long whip. The water churned violently due to the aftershocks from the battle like a giant whirlpool, while Ezra stood at its center, killing duct beast after duct beast. After a few dozen minutes, the waters gradually returned to normal. The prince stood there and waved his sleeve as dozens of duct creation energy crystals flew towards him and were caught by his hand. All of the duct beasts that had surrounded him earlier were about 100 feet in length. Although there had been many of them, each one was at most equivalent to a first, and thus naturally did not pose much of a threat towards Ezra. Hence, after a brief display of his abilities, all of them were slaughtered, gifting Ezra numerous duct creation energy crystals. Ezra kept the crystals, but his brows were still tightly furrowed. The crazed and desperate way the duct beasts had attacked him earlier was definitely not normal. From what Mubarak had told him, the two biggest problems he had to deal with in the energy reservoir were the high consumption of spiritual energy due to the pressure in the water, and the extreme difficulty in finding these ducked beasts due to their skill in hiding. However, from what he could see, none of the ducked beasts had any intention of concealing themselves, delivering themselves straight to his front door instead. This was inconsistent with what Mubarak had told him. But it seems to be a good thing? If these ducked beasts did not voluntarily send themselves to me, it would have taken me at least an entire day to hunt so many of them, mumbled Ezra to the two cubs who were glued on his shoulders. At the very least, his harvest was pretty good so far. Thus, he only pondered over this matter for a little, before once again rapidly propelling himself through the water with his spiritual energy. This time, however, his hand was tightly clenched around the EFSA while the other hand summoned the poisonous hook Dripa, and his expression was more vigilant than before. After traveling for quite some time without detecting any activity at all, Ezra began to relax a little. It may have been a coincidence earlier that he just so happened to chance across a group of ducked beasts, right? MHM? However, before the prince could fully convince himself, his expression suddenly trembled. The spiritual energy in his body began to circulate, covering it as his eyes gazed towards the front. The waters there were rippling as dozens of giant ducked beasts began to surface. The two beasts leading this group had reached a length of over 300 feet, while the rest were approximately 200 feet long. These were comparable to the fourth-level core formation experts. At this current moment, these beasts' eyes were likewise filled with greed as they locked onto Ezra Zephyr. The prince sighed softly, no longer any doubt in his heart. This was no coincidence. There seemed to be something on him that was drawing these ducked beasts. What exactly is it? Ezra pondered. The ducked beasts before him clearly were not going to give him any time to think. They released a peculiar cry as their enormous bodies seemed to cut through the water, charging straight at Ezra Zephyr. Glittering wind and light. A giant ball, that glowed myriad of twinkling lights, was powerfully thrown downwards the beasts. With dreadful power, it smashed into the head of the 300 feet ducked beast at the front of the pack. Boom! The glittering wind and light ball landed as a wave of spiritual energy exploded, making the waters within a kilometer simmer violently. As for the ducked beast, it was instantly blown apart. Ezra's body gradually turned gossamer, transforming into a blurry shadow as he shot forward. Ducked beast after beast exploded without any resistance. The battle was swiftly over. With Ezra's current strength, he was able to easily kill even a fourth-level core formation opponent. These merely third-level equivalent aquatic beasts were naturally unable to stop him. After the battle was over, Ezra collected the ducked creation energy crystals. The water rippled with a swing of his hand, as he let out an icy chuckle and said, "I won't turn away any of the energy crystals sent straight to my doorstep. I'm itching to see just how many you guys will be gifting me." The moment his voice faded, Ezra's figure swiftly shot forth again, brimming with motivation. He was done with mulling over the issue. It did not matter why these ducked beasts were coming for him, especially since his goal was ducked creation energy. The more that came, the better it would be for him. As such, Ezra encountered another 5 waves of ducked beasts in the next hour. The battles that erupted were extremely intense. The prince couldn't relax at all, causing the waters around to boil violently as all the ducked beasts that appeared were slayed. It could be said to be a full and bountiful harvest, a look of excitement revealing itself on his face as he hunted. 8 lost dragons, 4th dragon. 4 dragons made of black lightning roared as they pounced, ripping a nearly 400 feet aquatic beast to pieces. A fist-sized ducked creation energy crystal rose from its remains and was grabbed by Ezra. Who else? The prince let out a hearty laugh. It's been a while since he fought like that. He had gradually grown more and more thrilled as he continued to hunt, not because the ducked beasts were donating a tremendous amount of ducked creation energy crystals, but the reason was that the stronger creatures were appearing slowly. According to his estimation, the number of crystals he had currently collected would already be able to achieve 4 paths of ablution. And it was accomplished in only 2 hours. With such a haul, the prince was now quite excited indeed. Working into a killing frenzy, the prince gripped the short sword, its tip pulsing sharply as he boldly declared, "No matter how many of you come, I'll kill you all." However, the instant his voice sounded, the waters to his front began to violently ripple as 500 feet fucked beast after beast rapidly approached at an alarming speed. There were a total of 8 of these 500 feet ducked beasts, along with dozens of 400 feet beasts and even shorter ones. A lineup like this immediately made the excited look on Ezra's face turn more thrilled. In front of these beasts, even a 6th level core formation expert will run for his life. Black bolts started to dance around his body, the water near him boiled as the prince said, "Here I come." Next, he held the 2 of his weapons in his hands and shot towards the swarm like a deadly arrow. He was no fool, he wasn't doing a suicide charge. He knew the limits of his power and the limits of his opponents. This swarm was indeed powerful and Ezra was merely a 2nd level core formation expert, but was he a normal 2nd level? No. This swarm maybe could injure him, but it was not powerful enough to kill him. Another fact to remember is there are still 2 helpers on Ezra's shoulders. Why would he worry about such a swarm of ducked beasts? Bubbles were emitted from the giant mouths of numerous ducked beasts as they violently jerked their bodies, rapidly cutting through the water, their figures turning into blurred shadows as they zipped towards Ezra. Ezra's body turned gossamer, his speed as quick as lightning. He clashed with the swarm, moving his body and killing numerous ducked beasts. However, it was not easy, the beasts kept growing. Ezra slowly retreated, he couldn't reveal all his secrets now, who knows, maybe these creatures had some communication skills as well. A human and a horde of ducked beasts continued their fight in the reservoir, occasionally encountering other disciples, who were immediately stupefied by this scene. They were having such a hard time searching for ducked beasts in the energy reservoir, so how the heck did so many ducked beasts gather to chase a single person? There were actually some disciples that thought of attacking, but after getting a clearer view of how many there were, their scalps instantly turned numb as they quickly backed away. A horde of such scale was something that normal diamond belt disciples had no confidence in handling. The battle went and suddenly the 2 cubs jumped away, the horde of beasts were divided. They ran towards Sko, LL and Hattie. It was at this time that Fenrir understood their strange behavior. "Boy, did you have fun?" "Yeah, I'm still having it." "So shut up," Ezra retorted. "Haha, boy, I know why they are after you," said Fenrir. "Care to tell me?" "The ducked beasts here are born from the duct energy emitted from the mountain duct. Although they possess no intelligence, they are still able to act according to instinct. Just like normal beasts that you find anywhere else, they possess no intelligence but move with their instincts. And what these beasts will become when they gain insight into martial prowess." Ezra's eyes widened as he said, "Martial animals." "Exactly, that's why the natural pressure everyone else has to withstand in the energy reservoir does not have much of an effect on you, because according to the nature of the duct, you are a martial animal, not a martial master. Your spiritual energy is force, and it is also due to the force that these ducked beasts have been chasing you. In their eyes, you are the most delicious of delicacies, and if they manage to eat you, they may even become sentient, allowing them to transform into a true martial animal instead of their current existence where they can only act on instinct." The prince was stunned for a moment. Although he had an inkling that this was the case, only after hearing Fenrir's explanation did he truly understand the reason. So the chaos force of mine was the culprit. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" said Ezra in a slightly peeved manner. Fenrir was clearly in the know long ago, but had chosen not to inform him. It was obvious that he wanted to enjoy the show. "If I tell you everything, life would be so boring." Disrespectful prince of kobolds, Fenrir hurled back. Ezra finally killed all of the horde, and not long after, Sko, LL and Hattie came as well, with crystals in their mouths. They handed over to Ezra and dwarfed their bodies before resting on his shoulders again.